Hello, Internet. This is Matthew, and welcome to the Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. This is not, as you might suppose, a podcast about surviving the zombie apocalypse. At that point, all hope is lost, and you should run into the horde of zombies. No, this is a podcast in which a variety of subjects will be examined using philosophy in the hopes of gaining greater insight and perspective. This podcast won't solve all your problems, but it will make you think. Your mileage may vary. Normies not allowed. On today's episode, I present to you a conversation I had with my friend, Mynaa. We talked about a wide variety of things, but the main theme of the conversation was education. A subject which most of us have a great deal of experience with, and a subject which most of us have very strong opinions about. So I'd like to thank Mynaa again for coming on, and I will most certainly have other conversations on this podcast with him and my other friends in the near future. So without further ado, here's Mynaa.
So, hey, did you agree to this? Yeah, I like that part of software when it actually asks you, are you okay with this? And then you read the disclaimer anyway, and it's some big long thing that one, you're not going to read, and two, that they could be asking for your firstborn soul, right? But you don't know it, but you just click okay anyway. And it's like, what are your alternatives? But we were actually talking about proper nutrition, and that for how all of history, people were a lot of times stuck with staples if they had access to food at all, and how that nutrition contributed to disease and illness. And also people used to be shorter, people used to be smaller, they used to not mature as early. In a sense, they matured earlier in a certain sense, right? Especially because lifespans weren't that long, so more was expected. Or there's a reason why kids used to work in the coal mine. It's like, well, they'll be dead by, chances are they might be dead by 10, 15 anyway. They're useful down there.
Oh yeah, I think for a good bit of human history, like probably the majority of human history, kids are really just thought of as mini adults. We didn't really have a concept of childhood, separate from adulthood. And yeah, that's a luxury we've experienced in the last 150-ish years. But back in, say, the Middle Ages, there was no concept of childhood. It was just like,
oh, no.
you're just a little person is all you are. You're like,
some people still carry it
of adults, but you're just smaller. And so I don't know. You think about a lot of the, say, psychological issues people had throughout history, and part of it,
sure.
I think, definitely came from the fact that children really weren't allowed to be children, and even today, in many ways, children aren't allowed to be children. So we're still struggling with this.
Right.
How to deal with.
Wait, that's a good point. Hold on, that's a good point. Because it's like we give a lot of lip service to that, to say, and especially in America, given kind of the mythos and the ethos over here of like, be yourself, and even things like, go back to Emerson and self-reliance, and he talks a lot about children in there. The whole thing is in essence about children, because it's about the future. And it's like the reason why you don't let children go too far from the plantation is like, well, look good, but don't look too good, because if you look too good, we're going to have to put you down, because you're going to put us in the past to shame. And Emerson talks about this explicitly. It's something Nietzsche talks about a lot too, when you think about it. Because even, like Emerson on one side, he says, we appreciate the past because it's this immaculate pedigree, and it's been proven, and it's, it's no ephemeris, right? It's real. It's something we see and we feel, and we know when someone is, you could say, virtuous or honorable. And I don't mean that in either a Christian sense or a moral sense. I mean that in a philosophical sense, right? Which I guess typically we think includes those, but I mean more from the self-creative or self-reliant or liberated spirit. Like that's the direction I'm thinking in. So because context isn't always the same, right? But that question of how to treat the children, because I remember even my dad, like he was regretful that he didn't have more kids. He's like, man, I could have had more workers, because he was itching to put me to work from an early age, and he did. And I learned a lot, but yeah, I think plenty of it, I'd rather be watching cartoons, but yeah, he put me to work.
What kind of work did you do, if you don't mind me asking?
Construction, demolition,
Oh, okay.
all sorts of stuff. Yeah, it's real funny because, you know, I can think of this really good example. Nietzsche talks about punishment and cruelty a lot, and you see it in parents and you see it in children too. But like I remember when I was a kid and we'd be on the road and we'd be in a truck and this beat up trailer on the back hauling crap or whatever it was, and he'd point to another junker vehicle and another, with the tow towing a trailer or whatever the case may be, and he just laughed. He'd go like, "Look, there's our people," and I'd get mad and I'd be like, "No, I don't want to do. This is not what I want to do with my life. These aren't my people." And he would just laugh and laugh as I got mad.
Mm.
And talk about cruelty. But I mean, he did a lot to, he knew what he was doing. Actually, he was applying pressure in the right spots a lot of the times. Sometimes not so much. Sometimes yes. And I think that there's a very fine line between understanding how to motivate, or, in a parent's position, it's actually a leadership position when you think about it, right? Because you're not just taking care of yourself, you got to command a child. In a country like America, I think of how much dysfunction we have here, how much mental illness. And if people don't understand what I'm talking about, they could turn on Cops or Live PD for a few hours and see that through a lot of this country, it's just like you have neighborhood after neighborhood and community after community of, poverty and destitution and lack of education. And you see the same people getting into the same problems and the same things over and over again.
Well, and I think on top of that, I mean, pretty much everyone who goes to public school, talks about how much they hate public school, right? I mean, nobody really, the K through 12 system, no one really has anything good to say about the K through 12 system. I mean, at most they'll say, I liked my teachers, or I had a really good fourth grade teacher. Like,
yeah, it's not inspiring. It's not actually teaching us to be either self-reliant nor in an individual sense, and how that pertains to let's say a civilization or society at large. They've never done like this, the civics, the government, the history. It's long been very shallow and very simplistic, and it's of necessity, I suppose, because
what I realized was, as I've gotten older, like I always had this kind of difficult relationship with education because I like learning and I like talking about big ideas. But I wasn't. I mean, when I was younger, I wasn't a good student, and then eventually I learned how to conform and be a good student and do all the stupid things.
You know what happens if you don't? If you don't, they punish you, and they also do other things. Like, I'm going to tell you a story, and I kind of want you to be discouraged. Not really, but it's a good example of what happens. And so it's like when I was in school, in my like I had a similar experience. It wasn't stimulating. It wasn't good enough. I had already had enough experiences outside. My dad would take me, he'd be like, all right, you're out of school for a month. We're going to Mexico. Right. Or, we'd go on road trips and we'd travel and we'd see things and we'd do things. And he was doing his own thing too. But so, my memories of school were like the best parts about it were leaving it. And the worst parts were always coming back. And, I saw the way other people acted, and it's like I could never do that, at least for a good portion, for many years as a youth. And then, what they had to do inevitably is that they put me in what they, now I think it's not politically correct, but these days they call it learning, or they used to call it learning disability, LD class. So they put me in there.
I was in similar classes in elementary school, yes.
Right. And as we had no business being in there. The reason I was actually in there is because I refused to play their game. I didn't want to sit down. I didn't want to look forward. I didn't want to act the way that they were demanding. And so they had to, and I understand that now. I didn't understand it back then. But I mean, look, this is the first time I've told this story. So, I mean, I've told a few close friends and, and family. And like, I remember I had a friend a European friend of mine who, when he was talking about he's doing his own criticism of American culture and education and things like that. And I told him that story, and, he became like really sad for a moment. And I think, anyone might understand why, going like, okay, well, if intelligent students get put in learning disability in this system, then the system, it seems to be what creates the learning disability. So like when I look at modern America, because remember, I told you my experience was very different. Like my dad would take me out of it. Like I never bought into education the way I see other people buy into it, to where it looks to me like they were successful. What they failed to do with me, it looks like they successfully did with everyone else. And that was to put them in learning disability class. That's what I think of when I think of American education. Now, obviously we have intelligent people and we have colleges, which have their own set of issues, right? Mm-hmm. And we have plenty, intelligent people. It's like, so what? Intelligence is like, a sea sponge is intelligent, it doesn't even have a brain, right? It can survive just fine. So intelligence is this relative thing. It's more like, maybe if you say not genius, but creativity, like there's a certain blend of maybe temperament and characteristics, including intelligence, that make us something more than just like, oh, look, we're a performing monkey or like a clever little robot, whether we're writing the programming ourselves or doing something like that or something else. But I bring all this up to say, like, that's what I see when I look out at this country, going like, oh, all these kids were put in learning disability class. It's why they know nothing about the historical sense, the biological sense, the evolutionary sense. It's why they don't understand, like, it's almost like history emerged in a vacuum. Like today, people talk about, and a lot of my favorite people, they talk about how, the modern American society is closer to Brave New World than 1984, which is true in a lot of ways. But in terms of the notion of the memory hole, I'd say that, today is down the memory hole before tomorrow arrives. And that's how, like people look at modern politics and it's almost like they say like, oh, things were fine until 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 60 years ago, things like that, the Great Society and all these other changes in liberalism and American democracy. And what you see is that mostly they look like schizophrenics with the corkboard, putting yarn, tacking yarns around, going like, dude, your guys' sense of cause and effect is botched, because cause and effect isn't real like we think it is, nor can we understand the first, we can never get to that cause other than, certain logical inferences, right? But it's not like we even have that well developed in terms of a science of, I mean, when I say science, I mean really expanding that notion of, well, shit, how far back does this cause go? Once upon a time, God was, what we settled on, but, that was the working model at the time. Very different now.
Mm-hmm. Back to education for a second.
Oh yeah, please, yeah. Oh no, I'm gonna stay with it for a bit.
I have an affinity for like well, since I'm a part of a Nietzsche Discord server, that tells you I like Nietzsche a lot, and I find his work very captivating, and I also find his biography very captivating. He just seemed to be a very interesting person, along with his thought. But one anecdote from his life that I really resonate with is he the reason he left academia. Now he was, if anyone doesn't know, I think he was like the youngest philology professor in Germany at the time. I forget how old he was.
That sounds about right.
He was in his, was it late 20s when he got that professorship or something like that? And he eventually left academia. And part of it was for health reasons, because he was just ill throughout his life. But another major part of it was he realized that he was really good. Like he was a good, complacent individual within this system. Like he had been rewarded, by the system from an early age. He learned how to be a good student, and he got all those rewards. He got all the he was successful, and he rose up in the ranks. And what he realized is, like, he hated it. He hated being good at a system that he despised.
Right.
And right. I feel something similar about that in public education, because when I was like, first, second, third grade, I really just I was interested in my interests. And so I didn't try hard at school, because in school they were talking about things that I just didn't care about. And then around fourth through sixth grade is when I, like, my transitionary phase, where I began to see, I began to get positive feedback from like my superiors in school. And then I was kind of like, I got hooked on that positive feedback, and then I became a straight A student. Right. Right. But what I realized was, under that, under this positive attitude, I guess, towards let me rephrase that. Despite being a straight A student, I like despised every minute of school. I just hated it. I couldn't stand it. I was very resentful of it. And I'm like a university student,
You're
and I
telling me.
still feel myself to be resentful of the system.
Oh, well, especially, well, again, I could tell you it's definitely, and it's changed over time because everything changes over time. You know, the changes in the last few decades have been palpable. But I was just, I was thinking about, you know, you mentioned that side of things, and it's like, yeah, you know, when I applied myself, it's like, dude, it was easy. It was like easy. Okay, it's like there, and it's like, you know, and people go like, okay, A's, F's, D's, like, what are you doing? You know, it's like, well, you know, I prefer to spend less of my time at school than, you know, if possible, I will spend as little time here as possible. So I skipped a lot. I got myself kicked out a few times. I did what I could to get out as much as possible. And it worked. And I'm not suggesting that people do that per se, because, you know, you know, there's, if you're not learning there and you're not learning it, because the difference is I was always learning elsewhere. I was always, this is why school is, it's like, why would I want to sit in a desk when like I can travel and learn about the world and communicate and interact? Like, this is what my dad taught me versus this is what this, you know, bereft system taught me, you know. And I was thinking about the whole like, and to give you an example how you know, and this is how absurd it is to me. Like, here's a story. I'll give a little bit of my self away here. Like, I remember it was government in high school, and we had to do a 50-page professional MLA term paper as, you know, the big project for the year, and you know, we had all semester to work on it, and at the very last minute, this was when the internet was much more newer, by the way, right? It was much more, you know, us youngins were far more savvy in using it more because, you know, like, this is before even cell phones, and then just as cell phones were coming out, not even the huge brick ones, but the smaller brick ones. And I went to turn in this paper, but so I hopped on the internet. I was like, oh, Spark Notes, what's this? I found a 50-page college paper on Machiavelli. I copied it verbatim, turned it in. And by the time my teacher gives it back to me, there's 2 grades on it. The first one is a big red F and it's scribbled out. And then, you know, over that is 100% an A. And she goes, I was going to fail you because I was certain you cheated. But it turned, you know, and then I didn't know this, but it turns out she was best friends with my English teacher, and my English teacher is like, nope, that's him. I mean, it wasn't. It was Spark Notes, but she thought I had the chops to do it. So I guess the thing is, it's like, if you're gonna cheat, make sure you know who and what's connected to whom. You know, it'll help your odds.
That's a funny story.
Yeah, and I didn't read Machiavelli because I was supposed to have read Machiavelli, right, and write the term paper in it. I didn't read it for a while after that. You know, I guess it would have benefited me, you know, earlier on to have read it at an earlier age. Like, oh, okay, these are the honest way. You know, here is an honest man. Like,
I mean, but what I like realized, or what I've realized is, I learn more, you know, on my own than I ever do in a one class. And if I really want to learn about a subject, I just study it on my own, because the way education really functions, at least from my perspective, I mean, it's common. I think it's just, it must be the teaching style, the way they train teachers, because subjects that I find really interesting on my own, if you put me in a class about them,
they'll make them terrible.
They're going to bore me to tears. It's going to be awful. I'm going to be like, why did I ever care about this subject? This is awful.
Well, I don't think they address the fact that our mind is our body. And if it's not stimulated and if it's not engaged, that, like, there's nothing really you can do to, like, you can't bridge that gap unless you know, we use an old metaphor, right? It's like catching fish. And I think that the way teachers, they're not really trained to address a present population. I mean, I don't know how else to put it, but I think maybe part of it's being modern people. You know, maybe it's that people are always looking elsewhere, always waiting for the next best thing, always looking to get out to, you know, whatever comes next in life, right? Everyone's in a hurry to get somewhere fast, you know, all these things, right? And you wonder, like, in the education system, like, how much, you could see teachers when you can usually tell, I think, when they're passionate about what they do, because they're more likely to, like, those are the handful of teachers who ever drew me in, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it wasn't so much that, maybe it felt like they were a living representative, like they embodied something, and that's what was attractive, because they felt human and alive, rather than just kind of droning on in the way that, we drone.
Well, I did have a really a really good fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Richardson, and she was really good because she recognized that even though I wasn't a good student, I was intelligent, that I had potential. There was something in me,
Yes,
that maybe other teachers or other staff members didn't recognize, and maybe I didn't even recognize in myself. And she kind of like tried to foster that. She helped me, like, she helped me. She introduced me to other students in the hopes that I would be, because I was sort of a loner. And then she
sure.
introduced me to the person who became my best friend at the
Are you still
time.
best friends?
Unfortunately, he moved all the way to France, and I haven't heard from him in a while.
Ew, France.
But anyway, like, that was my most important friendship at the time, and she introduced me to him. And she also just tried to help me with study skills, tried to help me just in whatever way she could. And after that is really the time when I became a better student. Now, I guess, I don't know. I mean, it's because I have a weird, like, I still respect teachers a lot. I mean, I think even if I distaste the system, even if I despise the school system, I still appreciate teachers at some fundamental level, because I think a lot of them go into it. Not everyone. Some people go into teaching and that shouldn't go into teaching for ridiculous reasons. But I think most people who go into teaching, they really do want to, like, teach and encourage learning and encourage education, but they're doing it in a system which is actively working against them.
Right, because it's not truly to, especially in the Enlightenment value sense, it's not truly meant to liberate everyone. It's not truly meant to educate anyone. It's like, it's meant to elevate anyone who can be elevated within the system, because then they will go on to bigger, better things. Like, to go to university is to be, I guess I'll use modern terminology, even though I, generally don't. It's like, you go to a university to be a part of the 1%, not to criticize and attack the 1%. It's like, what do you think you're doing there? Like, oh, you're there to either fight the system or tear down the system. It's like, dude, you're in the system right now. Like, you're advocating on behalf of the system, whether you realize it or not. Like, there's this side to it all that, it's like, you see the pull in more liberal academia, where the pull is towards, again, a very weird modern subset kind of, I guess you could say remainders or offshoots of Enlightenment values and, liberal democracy and Christianity primarily, because that's what the morality all is, right? The morality of all because, and I guess if it's not clear, I mean, I'm sure you get where I'm going with this, that we're talking about the people in this country who are from the top, who criticize the top or pretend like they got out of the business or that they washed their hands of it. So to see, like, the wealthiest and most protected and privileged members of a class, of a system, within the system, hiding in the system, hiding in behind these walls, like, criticizing everyone else as if not only that they're holier than thou, but as if, it's just a really weird thing to see it's not a weird thing, because I think we were always headed here, but to see it manifest in real time, it's just, it's almost like it's like, it makes the past seem like just a strange dream. And I'm talking about the resentful attitudes that are kind of inherent in a decadent country like America, because it's a very decadent country where, founded in, not just Christianity, not just democracy, but also the worst parts of it are revolution and slavery, and not to the degrees that I get. It's part of our history. That's fine. It's not to. It's the Nietzschean understanding that there's no end to the Great Revolution. Like, it's going on in this country now. It's been going on in France for years. So you see all these big countries that revolt. It's like once they revolt, that seed is there, and then that resentment just comes full circle. Nietzsche's got this aphorism about something along the lines of the state as producer of the anarchist. And they're just right. They're reacting. It's like, animals outside their natural habitat won't behave the same way in their natural habitat, and then from there, further exacerbated or agitated, who knows how they might act, right? They might react desperately. They might, and then with us, the notion of holding an ideal and even having an ideal, it's almost, to me, it almost seems like it's the unreality or the fiction that we prefer to this otherwise, like, the reason why people need an ideal is because reality otherwise is too painful or ugly. That's why I think, people cling fast to that stuff. And it's instilled from millennia of religious modification. And by that, I mean the way religion and the priest classes and the king classes and the philosopher classes have shaped us over time. Because again, the only reason we're having these conversations is because very intelligent and creative men a long time ago mapped out the spaces, and they figured out the language, and they figured out how to relate it. And then our own education process is actually to tap into that, because it's what is the what's otherwise the point of having a culture and a civilization but to promote it and educate people to live within it so you can survive. It's actually like, it was never some grand vision. There was never a big plan behind any of it, right? There was never actually a unified goal. Like, people for a long time in the West, they thought God was going to come back and destroy this awful planet. Is why Nietzsche calls it nihilistic, right? Because it's a belief in nothing, because if, you're taking the first principle that God is dead, or, however you want to word it or think about it, we don't, generally, most of us these days, like, we don't even talk about it, right? We just operate as if it's a first principle, right? We moderns. Shit, I forgot where I was going. It's somewhere important with that. Got sidetracked on that Nietzschean notion.
I mean, well, I think like, example, I guess, of like, how, I don't mean to keep harping on education if we want to like go
no. Hey, just the first podcast I ever did, the focus was on education. Like, in my mind, it's always education. That's what this is. That's all. That's the point of any of this stuff.
That's well, that makes me feel a little better. But so, like, if you think about the way history is taught in schools, the reason history is so the reason people are having so many debates about the way history is taught is because there's sort of this there's a fight between I guess, let's say, the historians, how history is written, and then how the leaders or how authority wants history to be taught, because that's not necessarily the same thing. A good historian isn't necessarily going to be liked by the politicians or the people that are in positions of power, because that they will be the good historians will be the ones that are calling out the tyrants and the dictators and the the malicious
and the fabrications, right? And the fabrications
and the liars. Exactly. So there's a what's the word I'm looking for? There's a need to teach history badly from the perspective of like the technocrats or from the perspective of the politicians.
No, that's a huge part, right? When I mentioned the quote unquote 1%, it's like in modern day, you can't leave out, the politics is one side, the way politics has infested education. The other side, like you said, is the technocrats. But keep going.
And you can tell the 1% the truth. In fact, you probably want to tell the 1% the truth, because they're the ones that running the show. So
they actually need to know, because a lot of history demonstrates that they never see how their own actions do them in. you know, they have their fears and they have their pathos of distance and they have their separation. And then by the end of it, you see that like, oh, these were the decisions that led to this decadence and decline. And then you see that, oh, people aren't aware of it. They can't see the big picture. It's inevitable. You know, it's like, you know, no wonder that it's almost like it's like a machine that attempts to maintain itself, but actually can't over the longest time span. You know what I mean? Like it breaks down to come back together again. You know, like I think, you know, I guess you could say cultures, tribes, on the larger scale, societies and civilizations. You know, where in history has there been a nation that hasn't inevitably changed its organizational pattern? And this can be everything from, you know, like a nation's boundaries and borders to, you know, because if I look to history, it doesn't matter where you go. It's like inevitably you have a dominant force and then a force that is coming up from behind them. And then inevitably they go to war out of necessity. And then, you know, it's the Persians and the Greeks, it's the Romans and the Greeks, it's the Romans and everyone else, it's the Huns and everyone else, right? It's the Russians and I forget who, you know, before Russia really became a nation, you know, because we like the way they solidified in modern times was to create a story about a nation state of these peoples as if it was a unified effort and everyone was on the same page and came from the same place. And it's like, no, really what it is it's a group of often many different ethnic groups within a larger category, right? Or within a larger race rather. And you think of the difference between an Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman, or maybe it's the tribes of Israel, or maybe it's, you know, the Han Chinese versus the Uyghurs, right? Like, it doesn't matter, but you see that similar, you know, one race lives in an area and they got all these ethnic subgroups and they've moved around a lot over the entire course of history. And then in the modern day, you saw that to get these people together, they needed to fabricate something. And they did. None of it, like, not like, I remember me and Keegan talking about it before, and he mentioned like, you know, by the time you're fabricating a story about your modern people who created this modern state, you know, it's like you're so, and you know, you champion your old blood and then these old ideals. And it's like, you're so far removed from not just that original culture, but even that way of life, you know, of a, you know, if you were going to say, oh, we were Vikings, maybe, let's say, using that one, it's like, well, you know, you're far removed from not just a belief in Valhalla, but any way of life that even developed that culture and that belief system, you know, in the first place, because that was a long time ago and that happened over a long period of time. You know, the development of any central cultural story. I mean, I think the Greeks demonstrated a profound understanding of the importance of culture. You know, how they educated people in Homer. And one of my favorite things about Homer is that Plato hated him. And one of my other favorite things about Homer is it, and this is from an analytic perspective, right? Like, what does that say about, you know, in case, you know, I think the Nietzscheans grasp it right away, right? But, you know, it's like, and also that the Greeks loved Homer and Odysseus, but the Romans did not. Like the Romans saw him as a scallywag, and I just love that because it says so much about the Greeks and it says so much about the Romans.
And it's also funny to me you brought up Plato.
Well, he's been a big part of this. That's for
sure. There's really this tension in Plato because, you know, like take his opinions on music. Like he obviously like adored music, and he thought it was a very.
Did he play the lyre too?
Yeah, exactly. And he thought it was probably the highest form of art. But at the same time, I think in his ideal society, he said it should be banned because he recognized in himself, like, oh, the music like carries away my passions. The music like inspires things in me. But that you have to suppress that because that sort of, I guess, in his view,
and why can't he trust himself? Or why doesn't he trust other people? Because see, that's the confession in that is like, okay, if it's dangerous, then the question, and it's right, it's an accurate, right? Saltz has said it before, I've said it before, it's accurate, right? Art is dangerous, like a weapon is dangerous, just like ideas are dangerous, and they always have been. I mean, like, okay, I'll give you an example. Even at age 5, when my brother was like, hey, eat this mushroom, this big old mushroom growing in the backyard. And I was like, sure. And I ate it, you know, like, you know, suggestions can be dangerous. And you see that if you don't have any kind of logical framework, like a 5-year-old, like Okay, reasons for eating the mushroom, reasons for not eating the mushroom. And it's like, reason for eating, well, my big brother who I adore and love told me to eat it. Reasons for not eating, I don't know. I have nothing. I got nothing. I win-win. I'm gonna eat it. And then by the time my mom's freaking me out, taking me, she, yeah, I don't know. I guess they had an aversion taking me to ever see the doctor. Like, she just took me to Walgreens. She's like, here, eat this and puke it up, and I was fine. Epicac, I think it was.
But
oh yeah, so back to Plato and democracy, that confession of why is it dangerous? And then if he loves it but thinks we shouldn't have it, that's actually already. Have you read Brave New World?
I have not actually.
Okay, so without giving away too much, basically one of the heads of that society, I think it's Mustafa Mons. Plato basically is Mustafa. He might say like, oh, I love and appreciate music, and I might want it and I might practice it, but I see that it's dangerous and I'm actually going to advise against it. And if we do have it, it's only going to be in these certain forms and manners. So already by the time Plato's putting forth his ideas, we're well through the Hellenistic, like we're well past the Hellenistic ideal, because that's many years since Homer, right? Or since the inception of those stories as cultural cornerstones. And by the time he's saying no, I don't like this anymore, we don't like this anymore, we don't want this, he's already and with Socrates before him, they were already shaping those people, and they were already taking us in a different direction. Is why Nietzsche says he says these things, they laid the groundwork for Christ because they followed a similar thought pattern.
I see Plato really, the later
philosophy,
Plato,
rather.
I see the later Plato, honestly, as like the repudiation of Socrates, which is so strange because, Socrates is perhaps the most important person in Plato's life, and he probably loved him more than anyone else. But then he seems to have come to
But it makes sense though, doesn't it? Because he's saying, now that I've established the rule, maybe it's best that you don't question it. We shouldn't have too many Socrateses, right? Like now it's like, but that's the problem with education. It's like, well, when you teach everyone to, have that little Socratic demon in their head, like what's the result? It's like, well, because he's not the same tradition necessarily, right, as the Cynics and as these other pre-Socratic philosophers who, again, what's so fascinating about them, like if you listen to that episode of the Nietzsche podcast where he talks about the pre-Socratics, right, and how they were more like archetypes of a philosopher rather than this is a system thinker, this is a system builder. It's like, no, they represented more like a possibility of the human spirit or human potential, because not all of them were kings, right? Plenty of, some of them were independently wealthy or other things like that, and some of them were like Empedocles, right? And then some of them were slaves, and some of them were former slaves. It's just like we have it's just such a host of characters. It's just so, and like so much of what they did was antithetical and is antithetical to civilization. Like one of my personal favorites, Diogenes, right, lived in a not just his cynicism,
lived in a barrel.
That everything he said, like
Alexander the Great to go screw himself.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And then and both in that story, both Alexander and Diogenes's replies are great within the context of that story, assuming it's true. It illustrates the point. And then even if the story is not true, the story came to be and was told because it was understood that it could be true. Like, input a Diogenes, input a Alexander, this is what might happen. And then that's what you're like, it doesn't have to be true. I think that's what myth and religion teaches us, is that for us to be educated in certain manners, it's like, we don't even have to believe in real things to learn to get along with each other. And this is one of the most telling things about us, I think, as a species. And that is a universal, because I think there are very few things, there's only so much that you could say might be universal in human nature. And the other side of it is that we don't have enough data, and we don't know, because we've already been shaped so much by religion and culture and each other, that it's almost hard to say, well, what was conditioned and what was natural and what's an instinct, and what's the difference of maybe a desire or want versus a need manifesting itself, or an instinct manifesting itself. Like if it's a primal instinct that can't be met in the modern day due to the way we maybe frown upon it, like then it becomes a question of, well, how does that negatively affect us? Because even back to the notion of being like a stoic, or I guess you take it, any of those kind of people who cast aspersions on human desire and human passion, like we talked about earlier with Plato, and what are the question becomes, what are they afraid of? And the answer to me seems pretty obvious, even though I don't think it's obvious, and that's that people are just dangerous. Not only are we potential menaces to ourselves and each other, but we never know how our lives to ourselves are going to affect us. So the notion is like, I can frame it like this. Think of a child has no conception of a car, because a car is foreign to their world until, I guess to the degrees that, and what I mean is that the car just doesn't concern them, right? They don't have to drive anywhere. They don't have to. Now, just because they're ignorant of the car doesn't mean the car isn't an important part of their reality, because if they don't pay heed to their reality and they stumble out into the street, the car might kill them, even though to the child's world, there is no real car in the child's world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he can't conceive of it and he doesn't really understand it. So my thoughts were similarly, let's see, like, I guess for modern people, let's say they're utopian, let's say, or idealistic, and the thought is, oh, we can just take our culture off this track and put it on that track, and we get rid of this and get rid of that, move this and move that, and teach this and teach that. And it's like, to me, there's no difference between that naive child stumbling out in the street and, and it's not to say that regardless of any philosophy or theory we want to put forth about cars, the philosophy and the hypothesis and the theory is completely irrelevant to the reality that a car might kill you. Because that's the reality. Doesn't matter how you dress it up. That's a truth. And it's a harmful truth to the degree that, it's a way that, I guess you would think it is harmful because it ends your life. But like I look to modern people, and then my questions, I tend to I gauge them real quick, and I'm like, oh, they're running out in the street, running out in the street. Got to be careful with that, because how it's a dangerous thing. How do you ever know when you're fooling yourself? I guess, right? It's a serious question to ask.
I like to joke that if I had been born in a different time, I would have been put to death long ago.
Yeah,
and I say that because, like, if you think about Socrates, to bring him up again, it really makes perfect sense why he was put to death.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I'm not even saying like I support it, but I'm saying
Zarathustra even says it, that
from the perspective of the Athenians, like he was a menace to, the assumptions that democracy is built on. He was a threat to, social cohesion in a certain way.
But I think it's important to say this. They tried to give him an out. They gave him plenty of outs, and a lot of kind of philosophers and religious people in this position have been in similar positions. They gave him an out. They didn't want to punish him. They were actually fairly civilized, let's say. But he twisted the knife, right? He asked for it, and that's when you said it makes sense. Absolutely, and Nietzsche talks about this a lot, and thus spoke Zarathustra. A breaker is a maker. I would say that, like, to be clear, I don't think decadents or anarchists and people like that, like, no, breakers aren't always makers. Sometimes people are just breakers and they're bad for the world, generally speaking, because they just destroy things, right? And I'm not saying evil, I'm saying bad, as in they're bad for stability, they're bad for cohesion, they're bad for culture. But yet at the same time, they're it's part of the friction, it's part of the cycle. If history is recurrent, if civilizational is repetition of organizational patterns over time, and humanity over time, because it's like, out of everything that's changed, like, we've changed the least in a certain sense. Like, the technology has, like, if the human mind, okay, imagine this. Imagine from no computer to the smartphone, that leap in brain power of AI, like, that is exponential. With us, like, it's much more slow. The organic process of artificial intelligence seems to be much slower than the one that we can create, even though we can't figure out exactly the framework of what's the reference point of intelligence. What's the biggest difference of you and an AI walking into a room is that you immediately divide the room in terms of what's interesting and what's useful, and you might see a tool and you can see 20 uses of it, and a robot might look at it, and because it has no context, it sees zero. And that's a huge problem, right? And I guess it's also like if you took enough LSD, right, it'd be a similar thing of like now everything that was previously uninteresting, now you can see it all. Like you didn't think that carpet was interesting 20 minutes ago, an hour ago, but now you're staring at it for 2 hours and it's, or the sand or the moon or the stars, right? And I think it's important to note that like our ancestors have been tripping balls and looking at the stars for a long time, and that it's like I think of that as something that has shaped us, right? The taking in of this, awe-inspiring and like and at times horrible existence. It really did impart, I think that like when pessimist philosophers like Thomas Ligotti say like they describe the religious feeling at least from the traditional sense of like feeling like a little bit of crud on God's shoes. And if you could think of like the philo-erection you feel, it something that really tingles your spine, and like maybe if you I'm sure you felt that listening to music before, or something like that, or even your own thoughts, your own, like you realize something. Usually it is with the revelation of something horrible or terrible or huge, something beyond you, where it makes you can't help but feel small in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't say that we should, and I don't mean that like talk about humility or say we should feel small. I'm just saying that's been the feeling, that's been the religious feeling. You sound like you're gonna go on.
I guess sometimes I guess an example that comes to my head is I'll just suddenly become aware in a moment that this moment will become a memory. So this moment when I'm talking about right now, it will become a memory, and it'll be like gone forever. The only existence will be, it'll be a memory in your head and it'll be a memory in my head. But other than that, like it'll disappear into the void, never to be seen again. We don't have time travel, so I can't come back and relive that moment in real time.
Right. And there's a lot going on in this moment, right? Like,
and there's a lot going on in this moment, not just our conversation. There's whatever, any background noise or anything you and I can like see in the rooms we're in, or
thoughts,
look out the
feelings,
window.
plans, ideas from yesterday. Yeah, hopes, dreams, like even just the feeling of being present in this room, like where I'm at, right? It's nice and cool.
It's like when you look at a photograph and, the photograph is so simple, but if I see a photograph of my past self, I just think like all the stuff the photograph doesn't capture. The photograph captures the physical. It doesn't capture the metaphysical, it doesn't capture consciousness. Right. It doesn't capture my experience in that moment, except
the profound depth of feeling and thought and any number of things that you may feel in moment to moment, or whatever the case may be.
Exactly. I guess going back,
education, Socrates, Plato.
Well, this is related to Socrates and I guess the concept of truth. So just a random historical anecdote, as you know, more people voted, to put Socrates to death than voted he was guilty. And that was because he was just being a total ass about it. He was just like, all of you are ignorant. All of you are, your lives are based on illusions. I am here to help you. I am the philosopher here to like guide you. And,
well, he put himself above them. Well, he was breaking their old values and creating his, and putting himself above him and prescribing to them as if a physician. Exactly. And I think Nietzsche's words on the matter are something like, Socrates could see that everywhere around him, men were like 5 steps removed from like decadence and destruction, something along those lines. That's what Socrates was observing, that this culture and these people were falling into disrepair. Like it was actually a decline.
And what I've realized is, and this sounds terribly elitist, but I can't get around it.
That's fine.
There are many people who, that their eyes and ears aren't open. And so, because I'm not really the kind of person who's like.
It's always been this way, though. It's true. It's true.
It has always been this way.
Yes.
And
I'm
not
to
like
Socrates and before him too.
I'm not really the kind of person that holds my tongue. So I've like,
well, good.
I've like talked about like ideas that like are, far out of the ordinary from what, the average person thinks about. And it, I do it less. I'm doing it less and less because I think it's sort of a waste of time, really. But like you have kind of
Well, it depends too,
odd.
you know. I guess
It,
this is where one of those old, right, is uh even Zarathustra talks about pearls and swine, right? Like
mhm.
uh I guess when and where, and then you know you can kind of test people out and see if they're receptive. And it depends to what purpose is and what you need, and you know I guess that's what it comes down to really, because part of a man's philosophy is inevitably it's like, well, what powers and abilities and you know potential like is at your disposal. And that's an important thing to understand about yourself, right? Because if you don't you know learn and take that in and pay attention to it, right, like I think that takes one away from whatever that constituent of forces is inside of us that is the natural will, right? For lack, we can call it whatever, it doesn't matter to me. To me it seems pretty demonstrable in nature, you know, from a caterpillar that looks like a snake to a butterfly that has eye spots to a grizzly bear with his teeth and claws. It's like we all have this will to power. In us it manifests very, you know, it's just fascinating with the right blend of, you know, because we're otherwise like soft and weak compared to all the other animals. We are so soft and weak, you know, the shit that they can put up with and the shit that they can deal with in their natural environment, you know, because you know just imagine existing without medication, imagine existing without all these things, and you know, and only the healthiest and strongest like live a long time and are, you know, can fight through it all, because to exist in nature is just to be challenged all the time. And then I think modern people are only, especially modern Westerners mainly, when they think that challenge has been overcome, they're mistaken. They just they fail to see that it is that thin line of civility that keeps the law of the jungle at bay and keeps this false reality instantiated of like, oh, we're equal, and oh, things are good, you know, things are good and simple, and you know that any of this is obvious or easy, when in reality it's like, you know, existence on this rock right now is a huge, complicated, and ever more complex system of, you know, none of it's guaranteed, none of it's set in stone, none of it's a promise, but people almost speak and act as if it is. And, you know, and you can question where that comes from because it's very naive. It demonstrates a complete lack of it's basically like you can see that if someone lacks the historic sense, and I'd argue not just the historic sense, also the biological / evolved sense. I think it was David M. Buss, right? He was one of the pioneering guys in like modern Evo Psych, right? And I think he was, maybe it was him who said something like, you know, he literally wrote, I want to say the first modern textbook really. Even though, you know, in theory, Nietzsche was talking about, you know, nothing, like there's nothing that we talk about of humanity that is free from the evolved sense, right? Like everything came into being over time, over through adaptation and adoption of, you know, whatever those changes were. Like one person discovers one thing is good and then everyone starts doing it or producing it or creating it or chasing it. I think part of the mistake of you know, part of it's both a mistake and a lie. Like I think, oh wait, here we go. If we actually look at the notes, because let's see, I haven't taken a look yet, but I remember I think I wrote something like, you know, at best it was you know, that notion of like, oh, everyone can have the same thing, that notion that we're equal, of like, oh, everyone can have the same amount of freedom, because it's like, what even is freedom? You know, like mankind, like in essence, he doesn't get any more free than this. What is freedom? Like, what's he free to do? What's he free from? What's he free for? Because it looks to me like he's not free from anything. We have perpetual problems like food, water, shelter. Like these didn't go away. Like even with the mass production of plastic in China and certain other like modern niceties, like none of these problems have actually gone away. Oh, and there's also sex and procreation, right? There's, again, stability of your culture and your society. All these things have always been perpetual problems in the sense that they demand attention, they demand solving. It's like you know, and it fall like any of our creations from an infant to a machine, inevitably the creation cries out and you can't ignore it. Because, you know, a baby crying, like that's a demand. You actually, like, babies have more power over a human being than just about anything else in the world, namely the parents, right? But obviously anyone who's sympathetic or, at least likes children or babies, they're going to hear a crying baby and just go, ooh, I want to make it stop, right? I want to ease it. I want to help it.
Well, this is why I wanted to bring up the, I guess, the limits of truth, because I've had experiences where, like, I'm trying to sort of impart, I guess, what I think is a truth to someone, and they're just not, like, either mentally or emotionally, like, ready for that, right? And this is why I was saying, like, it makes sense why Socrates was put to death, because he was sort of talking to people about things they weren't willing or able to talk about. And so,
well, part of it is, right? Part of it's the pathos of distance. So part of it is because I've noticed this behavior in people. It's common, and it's like, hey, let's be friends, let's be equals. And now the notion of friend, it carries this. It really intends that this is a reciprocal relationship. That's the hypothesis therein. If we're friends, this is mutual. This is reciprocal. And if someone actually can't requite, then you can call it a friendship, and sure, it could well be, right. That's maybe acquaintances and associates, things like that. That's all well and good. Being civil and polite and nice, that's all perfect and well and good. But in terms of actually going in that direction, it's like, yeah, if you see that they can't requite, then it's up to you to make that discretion. But here's another thing. Have you ever used it? Like, have you ever tried to talk about, like, you're talking to someone, and then rather than kind of going for the overt approach, maybe you kind of take a back door, or you look for maybe a hole in the wall of their defense, and you kind of take a different tact and explain it from a different angle. Like, a lot of times it's not even what you're saying, it's the approach. And then you realize, like, oh, well, aren't we all just so, like, demanding, right? Like, oh, we all expect to be treated like kings. That's what the notion of a sovereign individual is. It used to be the king's rights, and now it's much more common. But again, with what is common, it's like, well, we don't consider it special, especially because we don't necessarily need the common. So I guess, my thoughts for your approach is like, well, I guess it's always, that's been a proverbial problem, right? Get in where you fit in. And then if you look at the best philosophers, it's like, oh, they don't fit in anywhere. That's actually what makes them philosophers. They arose because of these other things. They're not actually a part of them, except when they make themselves a part of them, which is just, like, to me, it's like, it's always convenient when a philosopher's philosophy, like, lines up with what they think and want. It's like, so if you're like a revolutionary liberal thinker, and it's like, oh, yep, my conclusion of my philosophy is liberality and revolution. It's like, well, that's very convenient. And this is why I think, this is why Nietzsche set such a high standard, and why he's such a good, like, to me, Nietzsche is he's almost like, in philosophy, he is the modern first principle. He is the modern measure, or at least he was the one who set the highest bar. Because he gives you so many different, not just, he talks about method, he talks about ways of analyses, right? He really gives the student and the reader a lot to work with.
I mean, I guess I'm my thought process is as follows. I wonder if well, I do agree with you about approach when you're talking to people. I think that's I think you hit the nail on the head there. But I also wonder if certain, like, conversations cause people to realize, I guess, the natural inequality, if you will, and so they get upset.
That's a horse show.
That's
a horse show.
How so?
Oh, okay. Well, okay. I'll bring up Peter Wessel-Zaff. He wrote a little bit in philosophy. He was more of a mountain climber than I guess that was his philosopher. He's a philosopher of the literal heights. Man after my own heart. One of my first memories is mountain climbing with my dad. I still go out to, like, was out canyoneering the other weekend, and got some more plans in the future here. But he talks about, he talks about the human mind and repression. Like, it's kind of, I see him as, he was the culmination of, like, Nietzsche, Freud, Jung, a lot of these thinkers, kind of in a real nice, I'm not going to say nice package, but both a brilliant metaphor and a profound philosophy, and it's considered pessimist philosophy because, again, these wind up, if you realize, oh, we're not as free as we think we are, and we don't have choice like we think we do, and we don't, in our justice system doesn't actually serve us in a good way, and our utilitarian pragmatic work, the way we treat workers, like the way that we exploit other human beings has been on the long term has been very bad and has created a lot of resentment. When I say bad, I mean as in, if the creation of your society and its wealth brings about the destruction of your society, then that was bad, right? That was all stupid and bad. You were doing something wrong because you could not sustain your power, right? It shows you that the leadership is lacking, let's say. Like, that's what that kind of thing tells me. I know I'm getting a little bit sidetracked from what the main track was here.
So you don't think
the horrible truth. Yeah, so Zaf says, he talks about the human mind as a matter of repression, right? So on one side, the first method he talks about is anchoring, right? Everything from, you going, oh, I'm a kid, I'm out of school now, I begin school next year, I know a few years after that I'll be going to university. Like, every time at those phases in your life, you're kind of anchoring into your life, right? Going like, this is what I am, this is what I'm doing. And then you have things like religion. That's a big anchor, a big rounded system of anchorings. A culture and a civilization is a big system of anchorings, because you have all these institutions that represent the culture, but it's actually kept alive by the people who live it, right? Who embody it. So that's just one. And then another one is distraction, right? Like, he uses the example, it's so obvious that, you can think of a million examples. Like, you have a little kid asking a million questions, and then, the parent goes, oh, look, a doggy. Oh, look, people painting a church. Oh, look, right? Distraction, right? Or it's like, hey, go watch, the internet all day, or go whatever it is to just waste your time, squander it away. We have all these other methods, but he said at the end of the day, the mind works like an airplane. The physics of it keep it in flight once it's in motion, but the crisis is acute once the engine flunks. So the illustration, I think it's a really good one. And you could probably see this most obviously when someone has a bad trip. Like, this is where you can see it, but you can see people lose their mind perfectly sober too, right? When they snap. But he says, what's revealed is that, you can go from, joyous and hilarious and having a good time to a very macabre and somber moment, because you realize in the depth and gushing horror of a moment, you realize that the mind is just dangling in threads of its own spinning, and a hell is lurking underneath. Because again, if it's a fiction and you're trying to spin it faster than you can unravel it, or faster than anyone else can unravel it, then it's like, well, if something really gets to you, and I'm sure you've had that experience in life, right? We'll call it disillusionment, where what you once thought was true fell away, and maybe you felt that without that thing there to either protect you, or, at least maybe center or ground you. Did you feel that like sort of coldness, or that kind of like, oh, well, what now? If I thought that and that's wrong, what now? Because to me, it's like, that's definitive of the human experience. And I guess it seems silly even asking you, because everyone can say, oh yeah, at that point in my life I was wrong about something. But I guess I'm thinking more like a profound disillusionment. Like, imagine if, I don't know.
Well, I actually had that experience in the political realm.
Sure, let's hear
it. Because I used to be, so most of my family are pretty Orthodox Democrats. There's my brother is a registered Republican, and so there's a little bit of disagreement here and there, but mostly it's just feel good liberals.
That's a good term for it, because I've heard them called generic liberals, feel good liberals. The most dangerous I call terminal liberals.
I also came up with the phrase a while back, Care Bear liberals.
That's fun. That's fun. Care Bear liberals.
But I used to basically, just toe the Democratic Party line, and I used to be a partisan for that worldview.
Well, they taught you to obey. Remember when you were so you were saying no when you were younger? Let me just double check this. You told me that you were saying no. They put you in those classes too, and inevitably you got in line.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly what happened.
See, like, there's the tendency. It's there. Like, and you started saying no, probably, like we all do when we're toddlers, like 2 years old. Sorry not to get distracted, but I think, right, it fits right into this. So go on.
Well, anyway, I now regard my future, my liberal self as, it was like a substitute religion, because my family didn't really inculcate a literal religion in me. Like
Right.
I wasn't, taken to church, and people didn't really, even the adults in my life really never even brought up religion at all. So I recognized, I knew about Christianity from other sources, but
Right.
it was never a part of my life. But I guess what replaced it really was liberalism, or a certain political tendency. I mean, and I think I learned a lot from, the liberal outlook. I learned how how liberals tick, so to speak, and I can't like hate myself. I'm not being like, oh, I was a
Oh
terrible
no,
bad person.
no, no, I absolutely. I'm good. I'm glad to hear you don't. That's unnecessary. I mean, I guess, look, if you did feel that way, it's like, well, you could, you'd learn from that suffering, but doesn't matter. Go on.
But like so I guess an example that I would give, last time we talked, but we were talking off air, but we talked about the Enlightenment.
Sure.
And one illusion that I think I've like totally lost, that I was like very committed to a couple of years back, is this idea of progress. I really view history now more as cyclical, more as the same forces, the same ideas,
Right.
sort of kind of resurfacing in different ways through
Right.
different
Well,
actors.
what's changed? Yeah, because what's fundamentally changed? Because at the end of the day, we have the same, right? Food, water, shelter, sex, right? We got the same problems. We have the same concerns. We have the same needs, education, and among the rest of them, right? Like, but go on.
I mean, I guess another example that like, solidifies this for me is international law. In the
Oh,
and I guess I bring that up because no one really respects international law. But I hear a lot of people on the left, they bring up international law as this, success story of
oh
Enlightenment
God,
values.
dude,
This
that
idea
whole globalist mindset, kind of in that direction. Oh, it's almost like it's just, to me, it seems like the next level of utopian thinking, right?
well, exactly.
If it was more like local before, of like, oh, it's our country or our people or our fatherland or our motherland, right? If it was those kind of things, like, oh, we're the greatest. And now it's applying a we're the greatest to like people who aren't even in your tribe or your culture, or your nation. And plenty of them are actively trying to harm you. Like China, the CCP is not America's friend. Russia, not really, right? Like, it's, they're competitors. They're competing powers. Like, people, even if they're the same culture, even if they're the same race, due to their power drives and their desires, they could well be your enemy. In fact, they could well be the person or thing that kills you. And yet modern liberals, they just have this very, very like ice cream and sunshine view of the world. I have no other way to conceive it, because like, here's another way to put it. Did you know, for plenty of people of the book, the Crusades never ended? That's something that those kind of modern idealistic liberals don't understand the slightest. That to plenty of Christian, Muslim, and I'd say probably even Jewish thinkers, like, in a sense, the Crusades didn't end. Like, that's still on, and the realities over there in the Middle East. And I don't say that because, like, we're not going to go over there. We're not going to get into that, because I mean, we can, and that's all well and good. But to me, it's, to the degrees that when people bring these up nowadays, it's always, what is it? It's always good and evil. It's always in the context of morality. It's never in the fact, like, no one ever wants to address like the far, I was gonna say the elephant in the room, but like the farce in the room,
Well,
behind it all.
well, this is why, like, moderate Christians infuriate me so, because they really are trying to, um, uh, I mean, I guess everyone sort of cherry picks their religion, so I can't say that. But
yes, it's suspicious, right? This is suspicious behavior. This
but,
is okay.
But what I would
Yeah.
say is the moderate Christian is like, doesn't acknowledge what you just said. I guess that the evangelical Christian, in my mind, is more honest, is less self-deceiving, and is less deceiving of those around him or her than is the moderate Christian. The moderate Christian has sort of tried to kind of, incorporate the, I guess, certain Enlightenment values with their religion, and they don't feel like they're in conflict.
Oh, right. Yeah. No. Great point. Absolutely.
And I can't really get around the fact that I think they are in conflict.
Oh, majorly so, especially if they have not, like, if they haven't squared that circle between you know, the historic sense, the fact that the notion of like, this is Carl Jung's observation from like 1950s, right? And it's, you know, we've had civil rights, and this is part of that, and it's part of the nation's founding and decadence, right? That they thought they could have Christianity, a slave religion of the masters, and break a piece off of that for their slaves, and then write a founding document inspired by the French, the fact that the war wouldn't have happened without the French, you know, French. And speaking of the heavy influence, because it wasn't just that the French gave us arms and that they trained us, and that all in that their navy, right, that their navy fought for us. Like, they were spreading their ideas as much, like they were proselytizing through war as much as anything else. And it's something that no one wants to acknowledge, because again, it's framed as in a certain, and at least in a certain sense, you know, I guess plenty of modern thinkers do understand this, but you know what I mean, within I guess that Enlightenment sphere of like, the moderate Christians, as you say, they're not the ones who give credit to, well, understand just how deep rooted this goes, and that this actually, by nature of its very coming into being and its existence, it's a perpetuation of a cycle. And the cycle is one of, you know, stability, and then hostility, and then revenge, and then revolution, right? And it just keeps going round and round in circles. And I guess, look, and I guess if we're talking about this, though, I mean, this is, to me, it's like, when I read Nietzsche, I think like, oh, he was, you know, he was profoundly affected by the Greeks and even the early historians like Herodotus, right? Or Herodotus, my bad, pronounced it wrong. Like, and I think, because I think, you know, that is in the kind of eternal recurrent mindset, you know, in the sense that when Nietzsche talks about it in Zarathustra, right, he calls eternal recurrence his most important doctrine. In his own personal notebooks, he writes, it's the greatest thing I've ever understood, and there's nothing beyond it for me. Like and it's illustrated and it's mentioned, you know, I don't know how many, countless times in Zarathustra, right? He's always talking about it. Going back to Socrates, you know, he says that the maker is a breaker, because Socrates was devising new virtues, right, and a new way of thinking, and he was breaking the old values and instilling new ones. And then, you know, within the same breath of, you know, both criticizing this while also championing it, Nietzsche also says how appropriate that they have to pay a price. He's like, that has to be, you know, and then Nietzsche recognizes the inverse. And I don't remember if it's, I remember where that's from, but we talked about it elsewhere before, but one of his best lines about, I think you even echoed it earlier, right? That you can tell that the modern Christians have lost steam because they don't even want to burn us anymore. And the reality is, had we lived long ago, or not even, honestly, not even that long ago, it's the right time and place. It's like, you could definitely get yourself killed sooner than not, depending on who you are, where you are, and what you want to say. If you know how to talk to people, you also know how to piss them off. You know, and it's like, look, you know, it takes as, like, I'm sure you've experienced this, it takes as little as one question to seriously upset somebody. And it's like, so how screwed are we? If one question is enough to make someone want to kill you, like, what about a whole line of inquiry? Because to me, a whole line of inquiry, scientific method or otherwise, even that is nothing, right? Like, that's barely even getting to a new hypothesis. That's barely even expanding our eyesight, right? That's just on our way there. We have to keep asking more and more questions, right? We don't ask less, we ask more. That's what's made us powerful. Not hiding, not turning away from these things, but embracing them. And to me, it's like part of the downward course has been to, well, part of it was the revenge of Christianity. And this goes back into the insidious nature of why the moderates are so insidious. And I'd say this is, you know, this is, but there's a lot of Americans, because I think, again, the school does a poor job of teaching it. I mentioned to you before, when Americans say shit like, oh, I'm just American, or I'm just this or that. It's like, yeah, you don't know how Christian you are. You don't know how Greek you are. You don't know how Roman you are. You don't know how many different things you are. You don't know how much Martin Luther King is in you, right? Like, you have no idea. You can't even tell. You think like these things are removed from history. You think they're in the past. It's like, no, man, they're alive in you and your thought processes. And to me, it's like that very conditioning, that's the thing that does make us get in line, right? Because if you have a large enough group of people who think the same, it's easy enough to organize.
I mean, I don't know how, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, you're good. I was just going.
I don't know how like you feel about the new atheists and their quarter. That's sort of old news. Like that was really back in the early 2000s.
We can talk about it for but we can talk about it for a few, because it's probably it'll come up. It comes up. Well, it's, even though, let's say, the new eight, like those particular atheists might not be on the stage, but we got a new group of like secular political people, and they are just as idealistic. They're just as idealistic. And then to me, it's like, well, you can mute any of their talking points and I just watch them express themselves. And it's like, whether I'm looking at a scientist, a preacher, or a political nut job, it's like they're all doing the same things. They're all excitedly professing their ideas. They're all waving their arms. They're all expressing a similar feeling. Because at the end of the day, it's a feeling that we're trying to, I think, translate and express to each other.
Well, I bring them up because I was like very influenced by them when I was a teenager.
For better or worse, because it could be, I could see a bit of both, right?
For better or worse, yeah. No, as I've gotten older, I'm definitely less. I've definitely moved beyond the new atheist stage of my thought process. There's definitely, I think some of their arguments are clearly way too shallow to be taken seriously. But
when more thorough critiques were written over 100 years ago, absolutely,
exactly.
yes.
But I do have to give them credit for at least acknowledging what we've been talking about, right? That you can't have your cake and eat it too. That you can't.
Right. But I think, they
support these Enlightenment values and
this is what our philosophers do, though. This is so. I think. Wait. This is an important point you bring up, because Nietzsche mentions it too. I wish I could remember the exact reference, because there's this really kind of hard, it's like a lot of this stuff, I feel like, with psychology especially, it's like you're trying to see the back of your head without a mirror. It almost like you're trying to complete an incomplete circuit, right? It's this thing that's really hard to relate and see when it pertains to, I guess, one's own blind spots. But that notion, I'll you go on if you remember where you're at. My bad.
No, you're fine. I mean, I still like have there's still a place in my thought process for the new atheist type mentality, the type of mentality that is we're not willing to make trade-offs, not willing to kind of give a rosy picture of things, that sort of like warrior or that warrior mentality of like, I'm gonna fight for this, so I'm gonna fight on this side.
That's the harmful truth.
Fight on this side strongly, because that really is what ideas are about. And the liberal mentality, I think, is one of, well, I don't want to and this isn't profound what I'm saying, but the liberal mentality is I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want anyone to be too upset with me.
And let me ask you this: how Christian is that? That is extremely super Christian, right?
Extremely Christian.
Because it's all based around like what your neighbors think, and then the pity, and you have to demonstrate the right amount of pity to show that you're a sympathetic human being, thus moral, right? Like we're just right back to Christianity again. And this is how insidious it is. And a lot of people don't realize that, because Zaf also talks about this with Nietzsche coined the term liberated personality, and Nietzsche liberated spirit, and then Zaf talks about a quote unquote what became popularly known as liberated personality, but Zaf had a more sophisticated definition of it, going like, oh, these people, they've scrubbed the conscious anchors, right? Consciously they go, oh, God's not my shepherd, right? Consciously they can say these things, but psychologically speaking, they are still dealing with 2,000 years plus of Western socializing and domesticating factors, including Christ's morality, including Socrates' morality, right? Including all those things. Like, you don't just say, oh, we've won. Like, you don't just say, I'm free of this and it's so. Like nothing, like I can't think of anything in the world that works like that. It's like usually it takes like rigor and effort and pain to get anywhere or do anything worthwhile, at least.
Well, and I guess too, I hope this example illustrates what I'm trying to say. Sure. If you look at the difference between, say, the life of Jesus and the life of Muhammad, I think the major difference between those two, and I'm not like trying to necessarily criticize or compliment one side or the other. I'm just trying to make a observation.
Yeah, well, we left the virtue and morality at the door. Like
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's the first principle.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it gets in the way of conversation, right? We otherwise couldn't have this conversation. We would have been like circling around, going like, "No, you can't say this. You can't say that. No, use this language. No, you're gonna offend somebody." Like, no, we're not. We don't like. Because here's the thing. I'm gonna draw a very distinct line here, even between me, like, and someone like any of those new atheists and people like that. I'll say this: not only am I not, it's not that I'm not just Christian. I don't share the values. I don't feel the same as other people do about these things. My physiology is different because I don't adhere to those values. I don't feel anything from them. When someone brings up Christian pity, it's like their heart might swell and they might like, and then whereas, I'll just leave it at that. I don't right. But go on. It is an important distinction though, right?
It definitely is. But if you
look
look
at
at
Jesus, Muhammad.
Yeah. If you look at when Jesus says, "Give unto Caesar Caesar's due," and you compare that with
that sounds like something a government would say. It's convenient, right? Like, oh, maybe like you can see they're like, oh yeah, make sure you put that one in there, right? Like how Machiavellian. We didn't even need to make up a story. He said it himself. Render unto Caesar.
And if you compare that to the Muhammad, the military figure and the political figure, as well as the prophet and the
Yes.
person who communicated with the divine,
many
pillars in one. Whereas at least according to Jesus of the Bible, whether we think Jesus actually believed what it said he believes, which seems more complacent, which seems more slave-like, which seems more.
Well, he didn't like the conflict. He didn't like the suffering. He didn't like the pain. He wanted us to be nice. Like when he says resist not evil, to me that means join us. Join us. Right? Don't resist it. And it's like, what the hell are you talking about? That's as out of place today as it was back then. And again, when you say evil, it's like it's because it's implying a morality because it's one man putting himself above others. So there's that side of it too. Well, I guess it's root of it, or part of the root of it. But the thing about like so it is a different organizational structure to have it where your religion is your culture, is your government. Like Islam is actually, I think a lot of Christians and Westerners don't understand this. In terms of a more successfully organized, inherently self-sustaining and self-correcting conservative philosophy, Islam is actually far superior to Christianity. And it's like the reason why is because, it's got the pillars are its entirety and it's all self-referential and it's all self-contained and it has what it allows. And when you allow for conversion by the sword rather than having a bad conscience over it in Christianity, it's like, well, you give yourself the freedom to do. It's very Machiavellian, whereas Christian winds up being strictly nihilistic because before long it's like, well, if I surgically extract your teeth and your claws and make sure you can't carry a sword, and I do whatever I can to thoroughly domesticate, and like I think by the time you're thoroughly domesticated, like you're also on the decline yourself because you're no longer in touch with these vital instincts, which maybe sometimes for humanity it's always been about head chopping. Right? Like we are a vengeful lot, at least the people of the book, let's say. That much, like it's in there, right? It's this part of the fun of the Old Testament. It's part of the fun of Islam is like, they're not ashamed of it. They're not ashamed to be like, our God's the best and we're going to kill you, like, it's like, okay, cool. You know what to expect. None of this, like, to me, Christ says he brings a sword, yet he doesn't carry one. He says he comes here to divide the houses. He has that kind of ballsy and brash, he flips the tables, he does these things. He's a real asshole, like a Socrates, right? They're all assholes. Inevitably, like when you okay, to the degrees that you've been a Socratic devil, like, look, you're an asshole, man. Like they should burn you. They should. That's why you talk about people getting upset with you. It's like, of course they did, man. Why do you want to hurt people? No, because back to the notion, the truth is harmful. So then there's a question of, well, it tells you that the truth actually doesn't matter for humanity. The truth has never mattered for humanity. What matters is that we can at least sustain ourselves within a given structure. and and like this reminds me going back to like Homer and the Hellenistic ideal compared to changing with the Socratic and the Platonic ideal, and then eventually with the Roman and Christian ideal. And those are a lot of the pillars of our civilization and our religion and our culture, because you wonder, like, had the Greeks and Romans been able to continue on in their tradition longer, I do wonder, like, I guess, we never make extreme logical jumps, right? You don't go from just like okay, we're at pre-algebra and then the next day someone figured out calculus, right? Like, it's a slow additive process over time. It's been a big cultural interchange, talking about the entirety of civilization, even thinking of the notion that, we use Arabic numerals and all that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. The integration, all that stuff has been very, the civilizational soup has been quite the thing to see. And it's like the people in it don't need to understand anything about it.
Well, this is why when I say that society is based on coercion, what I'm trying to say is some people's will be imposed on other people. Like, the society really isn't based on all peace and harmony, and we're all going to get along, and we're all going to have a say in everything that happens. Society is based on, no, I'm going to impose my will on you, and you are going to submit or die, basically.
Okay, well, hold on. No, that's a very good point. And then let me ask you, so then what does it say? How successful have we been in even instilling the idea that, it could be some other way? Because what are the revolutionaries otherwise saying? What are the idealists otherwise saying? They keep saying there's a better way. We don't have to. And it's like, well, by the time you're revolting, though, you're just you're trading places. Time is a flat circle, right? Like, where are you going? Like, where are we going? How many harebrained revolutions do we need? And the answer apparently is every single one of them, right? Like, the answer is, try to get people to see it. See if people could even help themselves. Because, I mean, you see, again, I understand why. It's completely understandable. Like, the decadence in this country are complete, like the complete lack of, a noble aristocracy, the complete absence of a philosopher in power to understand or mitigate any of these just amassing problems. And I think I mentioned to you before the Nietzsche quote that, the reason why a nation goes to war is to perpetuate itself. It's to stay in power. It's to avoid suicide. And to me, it's telling that the American government and even the American people, we haven't cared about winning a war. I mean, people say they care. But the results are the American government has not cared about winning a war in almost 60 years. That's telling. That is decadence and decline, right? That is the will of a people falling away. Like, I don't know what it's going to turn into, but it's almost like, well, at this point, isn't the army just a private organization? Like, isn't it a private organization? I don't know if it's, the same, because who's really behind the curtain? The same people who own the Fed. And you wonder, like, well, why do they tax us when they just print the money anyway? Like, you get a student loan. My understanding is that they're literally just that the Fed prints that money there on the spot and says, you owe us. To me, it looks like, and so I get it when people go, like, when the modern slaves say, we don't want to be slaves. I'm like, sure. But again, who else is going to take care of you? Like, no animal evolved to be, aside parasites, no other animals really evolved to be dependents. We either evolved to coexist within the same species, and you see species also work together. What do we call them? We call them symbiotic relationships. And I guess symbiosis itself doesn't imply non-harmful.
No, exactly.
Right. And I get that's parasites fits in there too.
I guess at the same time, though, I'm not I don't want what I say to make people pessimistic. I guess I don't want what people,
no.
I don't want what I say to make people not want to, actually engage in the world and engage in affairs.
Right. Well, Nietzsche calls it a brave pessimism,
and the lives of other people maybe more bearable. Say, I still believe in changing the world, but I believe you can't change the world without acknowledging certain realities.
Yes.
And if
because then your analysis would, it'd be an important, it's a vital piece of information to otherwise miss. because otherwise, like with a lot of even if we go back to the rational atheists, is for some of the good points and things that they might have said or did, it's like even that notion to either proselytize for atheism, or the notion that belief is rational in the first place and therefore you got to try and convince people, it sort of misses the point where when you do the homework you realize, oh, there's actually a better approach, there's a better angle, there's a better lesson besides just, again, what to me is otherwise a first principle. Like I guess, like I said, both Nietzsche as a measure and standard, as well as, death of God and its after effects as a first principle. Because when I say after effects, I mean growing pains of nihilism and pessimism. See, because the permanent pessimistic, like this, because this is important, I think, to what you were talking about. Yeah, to not be, because the difference is, it's one thing to be pessimistic and nihilistic and be stuck in that rut, because the only difference between a rut and the grave is the depths. So it's actually your own suffering and your own problem and your own lack of vision as to why you're suffering for people who get stuck there. And then, like, how do you see your way out of it, right? It's very hard. For some people it's a phase, other people just live and die there. And maybe they have even more profound reasons to be depressed and upset, like a dysfunctional family, or they don't have anyone in their life, right? It can be a lot of things as to why people feel the way they do. But at the end of the day, the way we think and act comes from the way we feel, and the way we feel comes from how we've been shaped. And that's, evolution, and that's the historic sense. And that's a lot of this other stuff. But to bring it all home here, there's a big difference between, the understanding that the truth is harmful, but it can also be quite brisk and invigorating. And that also, when it comes to pessimism and nihilism, it's good to understand them because they are actually growing pains that people suffer from. So the more you understand them and can address them honestly, the more people can actually understand you and benefit from you. Because look, my entire life, I've watched in this country, since I was like old enough to observe it, like the nihilistic tendencies, the cynical tendencies, the suicidal tendencies, the unhealthy like the decadent tendencies. Because what I came to see and understand is, like, yeah, the drives for decadence and health and strength, they're not the same as the drives of decadence. Again, like, I think the best example is an animal in a zoo, is a much more depressed animal than an animal in the wild. So to the degrees that the mind becomes an enclosure, Emerson talks about this, I think Heraclitus taught, like everyone talks about, like all the wisest men for the wisest of time have talked about how consciousness becomes a prison. When things go wrong, that's what it kind of feels like, right? So in the face of that negative, cynical, like want to drag you down and destroy the world sort of nihilism and pessimism, Nietzsche suggests, I think, what he calls a brave pessimism. And that's going like, yeah, we can talk about this. It doesn't make me not want to live life. It makes me laugh even harder because so much of it's so absurd or insane, or, like, it's funny to me. And I guess because it kind of has to be, because otherwise it's like, well, it makes sense why so many people are depressed and why so many people are bumming out, or why in their disillusionment, rather than finding something new or creating something new, they fall by the wayside because they've lost so much. I guess the biggest corollary I can really think of to illustrate, like, if you heard the concept of death of a soul, like, and if you have a tribal people and then you hit them with Western civilization and destroy their belief system by proving it wrong in too quick of a manner, and like that kind of thing, like if you have no way to adapt, well, I don't know. Okay, it'd be like, I guess the closest equivalent that we could conceive would be if aliens came down. If someone we were completely foreign to came down and told us our conception, even our more sophisticated conception, was completely wrong, which, well, could be, right? Like that would be the closest corollary. And then to be so profoundly wrong, it would just, like, you can imagine like your heart dying at least for a second. I think maybe we would get excited and go, all right, Mr. Aliens, what do you have for us then? Please, I would like to know. Like, I get it. It could be harmful.
And even Peter Gay, in his 2-volume history of the Enlightenment, which is just called The Enlightenment Interpretation, he like one of the first I think the first or second chapter, goes over the details about how the Philosopher were, in constant battle with their own value or their own culture, their own inheritance. They were they literally, had, dark nights of the soul where they're like, is this really the way, in terms of questioning their heritage. So,
right.
In revolt against Christianity, there were many times when these thinkers such as Hume and Voltaire were like kind of questioning whether they should revolt against their Christian heritage, and ultimately most of them did.
Hume was one of the best of those times, by the way, and it's like to me it's partially it's his Scottish character. It made him different than the Anglos over in Britain itself, right? I thought he had a distinct character that I guess like. Okay, go on. I'm getting sidetracked here.
No, you're fine. Well, Peter Gay was also saying that the last chapter of the first volume is about Hume, and he was making the argument that Hume was really the one who most completely liberated himself from his Christian heritage.
Yes, I saw that. I thought that was apparent in him too, compared to a lot of the other thinkers, both before and after him.
Because because Hume's sort of point was a lot of let's say the deists. So Voltaire was a deist, or so was Rousseau. And the deists were still desperately trying to hold on to this idea of God. They were saying, I hate all this theology. I hate, I don't believe that Jesus is the son. I don't believe in maybe heaven or hell or whatever, but I still believe in this force larger than myself that was the unmoved mover, the first cause in the clockwork of the universe. And somehow he's like he's kind of either supervising everything, or he's just kind of detached from everything. But for some reason the certain thinkers in the 18th century couldn't get over that aspect of the Christian tradition. But Hume, as far as I can tell, was an atheist, so he did not have the same doubts.
Oh yeah, no, it was apparent, and like I said, to me, I think I attribute it most to his Scottish character, because they were, it's like the difference of, you look at, Nietzsche, even though he talked about being a Slav and to all understanding, like he was an Anglo, right? Like he was Anglo-Saxon, he was German, but he talks about being being Polish, and even later in the end of his, like people call it, I think they tend to say it's a disassociation. I see it as something else when he says I'm a Polish Jew. Because he hitherto talked about like how much they smell and how much they don't like him. It's basically the equivalent of being like, it's like he's saying I'm a stranger. That's what he's saying. But you think about how different he was from the people around him. And then, you go, okay, well, what was in his character? Because like part of it is, like I say, Nietzsche's probably one of the biggest genius, if not the biggest genius who ever existed. And then you go, wait a minute, there's something kind of not daunting in that, more like, in that, in the sense that, well, to modern understanding, it seems like he might have had a brain condition. So it's like, to produce someone as smart as Nietzsche, not only do they have to be well educated in all these other factors in his life that contributed to make him who he was, it's like, you also have to have a brain tumor that apparently makes you, that I don't know how it might, it's been observed, right? How brain tumors affect thinking, and how certain effects and phenomenon can further affect our thinking.
Or there might be a connection between like being really, really intelligent and having some form of mental illness. I think Nietzsche, I think Einstein, one of his sons had like severe schizophrenia, for example. Like for some reason, perhaps it paradoxically, like
we see it in the Jews too.
Intelligence like also might lead to genetic
right. There's no guarantee that we're supposed to have. There's no guarantee that we could ever have like a 5 to 1,000 IQ, because we might be drooling idiots. We might see so much that like our body collapses under the weight of the internal sight that might come with that. But I think the internal sight has to be developed. Like what's apparent to me is that we evolved to see things from the external, but the creation of an internal self in an internal fabricated world, like that changed our sight from external to internal. And so, but that also made us powerful, right? Through that came our understanding of everything. Like to me, it was that transition, the going from an external animal, and as predators, we have 2 forward-facing eyes, right? It's very significant that we have that, because that also shaped us immensely. But bringing back around, like I see that national character, right? You see it in what do you call it? You see it in Rousseau. You see it in Voltaire. And then in Hume, like Hume seems so much more independent than everyone around him of his time. I mean, he draws a few lines that just other people weren't drawing. And it's, to me, it's like clear as day when you see those changes happening and when you see those strict demarcations, because it's otherwise such a departure. And I think us moderns really take for granted, the price that people have always paid for that and how hard it often is. Because I even think of Nietzsche, like how hard was it for him to distance himself, not just from the society and the things around him, but like his own race, his own people, his own, and he did it for a good reason, and he had to. Like it was, I'd say, like, to me, it's like it's part of who he was. It's part of his needs. It was part of his needs and his virtues as a philosopher. But then that's no small thing for a social animal to go, boop, see it. And I guess, again, to me, it's temperamental. So it's like, it's not like anyone can do, like, not everyone can be a wandering mendicant. Not everyone can go sit in a monastery, right? Not everyone can be a philosopher. We have different talents and different purposes. But sorry, I guess it's, I like to parse these things, the national character, the racial character, all the other characters that really create a profound thinker. And I think, because I think they're far more important than we generally give credit for, at least in the shallow Western conception. Like, look, Nietzscheans do a good job. A handful of people do a good job. Everyone else, it just seems to be propaganda and politics, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Hume really, I guess you could really think of his breakthrough as epistemological, really, because he was sort of one of the philosophers, not the first philosopher, but one of the main philosophers to really like shatter the rationalist conception of the world.
Yes, I love him. Yeah.
And he basically was like, well, a lot of the things that we're taking for granted, they're just assumptions. And I think he does say, well, we kind of have to take them we kind of have to have these assumptions. We can't really live without these assumptions.
Right.
But if you don't acknowledge that they are assumptions, then you're not truly being intellectually honest.
Yes.
But if you take the idea, like, it's hard to really, like, incorporate, I guess, the idea that causation is just something our mind might impose on the world, just because it seems like something that's so obvious and
okay.
To our experience.
I have a theory. I have a theory that belief emerges from an actual need to know. But then that need to know isn't what we think it is. It's not necessarily a noble thing. It's not necessarily a big thing. But what it is we just need to repress this world so we can get along in it. It's like, hey, if you tell me that loud noise over there was a firecracker and not a gun, that puts me at ease. I needed to know that, actually, because even if mentally I'm telling myself it's not a big deal, my body might have reacted with a physiological alarm, right? And so my need to know, am I safe? And then you confirm that. And then if you're wrong, we both might die. You can go a lot of different ways with this, but I think it's like, it's rooted in that, right? Like there's no escaping these things. It's like, the need for food and water, like a lot of it is that deep. But like Hume says, they're assumptions, but they wind up being necessary assumptions, because at some point we have to act in this world, and all of our philosophy and our religion concerns itself with that stuff. It's at the end of the day, it's like, despite a mythos and a pathos and all these other things, to me the synthesis is for an ethos, because if there's no ethos, then what is there? Then to me there's nothing, right? If your philosophy, if you can't base your life around it and living according to it, whatever that may be, then it's like, well, I don't know what you're living, but it's not a philosophy and it's not your philosophy. Like, from what you've told me, though, like, you've been developing, your thoughts over time for a while there. So, you're well on your way.
I think this is why Nietzsche says somewhere, like, don't tell me you're free. Tell me what passion you're enslaved to.
Yes. Oh, that's yeah. That's a great way of putting.
So at some level, I guess what I'm concerned with in my worldview is what assumptions am I willing to have, and what assumptions am I not willing to have? I'm acknowledging that a lot of what we take for quote unquote truth are assumptions, but I'm saying not all assumptions are created equal.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Oh, dude, absolutely. That's our value scale. And there's nothing wrong, dude. Esteeming one thing over another. Are you kidding me? That's to me, that's like that process, and that, I guess, again, I think of Nietzsche's words, right? To lay slavishly in the dust before all the trivial facts. That whole process of judgment, of value creation, of value seeking, of whatever you want to call it. It's like, to me, that is the bread and butter. To me, that is part of the hunt. And it's like, look, philosophy or otherwise, like, the hunt is always better than the procurement, because, the procurement is the safety. The fun is in the danger. So, there's that side of it. And I guess it depends on, like you said, it depends on an individual and their needs, their desires, right? This isn't a one size fits all approach here per se, but I think a better approach in philosophy isn't going, there's no such thing as one way, like Zarathustra says, there's no such thing as one approach. But I would say that the discerning one knows how to make themselves, knows how to approach others and also be approachable, right? Like these are the, like, so what are the, again, what is the ethos that's derived from these conceptions then? Like you saying, by esteeming one thing, these other things fall away. And the more you do that, the more and more falls away. And in my experience, is like there's very few things in the world that actually matter or that need any of my time or my consideration. Very few things. And I don't mean that like, that's not to say that's not a cynical judgment or anything like that. That's just saying like, oh, this is, this can all be background noise, right? Or this is irrelevant because at least here the root causes and conditions are elsewhere, or there's a deeper reality or substrate behind this that we're otherwise ignoring, thus this problem perpetuates, right? Like there's all these different kinds of approaches and whatnot, and like ways of, I guess you'd say, analyzing. And I guess if this is technically what the Philosopher's Guide to, this is part of the Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse, this is, I guess, where the rubber meets the road, because I could say for a lot of philosophy and philosophers, and I guess more of them I think are social scientists and that kind of like soft science and soft history and just soft-headed reality, really, like in that direction, all those people, it's like, well, that's the botched and the bungled, right? Like those are people who, a lot of them have no business philosophizing. They have no business over here because they're, to me, like when I look at them, it's like, well, they're still living hundreds and thousands of years in the past because they're literally using the same beliefs, philosophies, suppositions from thousands of years ago with little to no modification. It means like they're modern, it's 2021, but people still have the physiology and minds of like cavemen, that kind of thing. Or even if we could say they're Christian cavemen, well, they're still cavemen, like they're still living in the past. They don't have access to this new, what you would call insight, what was developed over time, right?
Yeah, I totally agree.
Right. And again, like all these other men did it, and they imparted it to us. They gave us the language. This drives, this, like when I hear Westerners say like, oh, we made up language, it's like, no, it's biological capacity. We might have made up the concepts, but that's huge, because thanks to someone taking the time to see and measure the unseeable and the immeasurable, thanks to that, we gain all sorts of new power. We gain all sorts of new understanding and joys and pain, also pains too, right? It goes hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And I guess this goes into Nietzsche and even like, I guess maybe Voltaire is one of Voltaire's blind spots a little bit, I think. But this is kind of the problem of ever more freedom and utilitarianism, right? The thought is like, oh, if we just have more freedom, now people will be happy and joyous. Or if we have more rights, and it's like, well, what more? Like if you have a full belly and you're not thirsty and you have a home, it's like you're probably better off than like 95% of people throughout all history who had no security or promise other than usually like a strict boot by someone else, or a much more strict boot, let's say. They're like, simultaneously, it's not lost on me though that for so much of history, it's just, despite all the cries of, injustice and all these other things, it's like, well, dude, for a lot of history, it's like very few people did the fighting and the worst dying, and lots of people were just, living life, learning, like just they were living and repeating a lot of the same boredoms and needs that we do. In that way, we share a lot with archaic man. I don't think we're going.
Oh, well, I was gonna actually, I guess, bring up a slightly separate topic.
Sure. Oh, wait, let me ask you this: how long have we been going for the moment? I'm game to go more. I think I'd just like to take 5. Do you edit these, by the way? I don't know what your process
Oh yeah,
is.
yeah. I could. We can go longer, but yeah, I was gonna. I could take 5
I'm definitely
game.
jot it down though, so you don't forget, because I don't want to make you forget here.
Okay.
Where you wanted to take it. So jot that down. If you're cool to take 5, I'll meet you back here in 5.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Talk to you in a few minutes.
Alrighty.
So I'll go ahead and say 3, 2, 1, and we're resuming here. I did want to mention one thing before I forget, because I didn't write this down, but in reference to Jung earlier, what I meant to mention about him and the failure of the Enlightenment values, or the more like the failure for those who were educated there and in that tradition. Like when Jung says that, you know, the euphemism of eating an apple, or the eating an apple is a euphemism compared to the actual actions of the Christians. And, you know, in step, someone like Voltaire, right, with all his criticisms. But that's, you know, that's what he said. And this was in the late 50s. So, you know, and you saw that reckoning come here in the US, and it's happening again, as a matter of fact. Right. And that's why I brought that up earlier. I completely forgot to get to the point, you know, because we're doing our thing here. But that was the important point that I wanted to point out, that, you know, like because there's this criticism of not just Europeans, but, you know, European values and systems. And it's like, no, you know, profound thinkers have been asking these questions for a very long time, actually. It's not foreign to the tradition to put itself on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a question of, I guess, you know, what comes of that? That's, you know, how are we measuring progress? Maybe that's the word that comes to, or that's the biggest question maybe that comes to mind, because to the pragmatists and the utilitarians, and even the Christians, and then the secular Christians, i.e. liberals, most, you know, some liberals are, you know, openly Christian, or, you know, religiously Christian. You know, it's like they want to make it seem like progress is their province, is their claim. And it's like, no, dude, it's been part of the Western tradition, and like smarter and better men than, you know, a lot of these modern thinkers have been tackling these problems for you know, hundreds of years, in theory, thousands of years. But that's you know, I guess it's kind of weird to bring all that up, because it's pretty big stuff, and then just set it aside. But go on with your thoughts. Where we left off earlier.
Yeah, so I was just curious what so a topic that you hear people talk a lot about nowadays, and one that I've like thought a lot about, but I'm still like, I guess, unsure where I fall on it, is the debate about, you know, individualism versus collectivism. Like, is the individual the most important, I guess, you know, thing, or is it a group that's the most important thing? So I was just kind of curious, because you mentioned how, you know, you know, that not one size fits all. So I was just wondering.
Right. It'd be insane to think that, because we have different talents and purposes. You know, it's like someone may fancy themselves a philosopher, and it's actually like, well, plumbers are actually just as important in their own right. You know, it's like, if it wasn't for the men who keep the electric grid on and the internet flowing and things like that, like, we'd be in big trouble. So like, it's clear that not everyone, you know, is supposed to do the same thing, right? Like, that much is obvious. Now, the notion of where does the individual fit in the collective, because this gets into more, I guess it's old Jungian thinking, right? Like, how is it that we ever came to say the individual mattered at all, when it's clearly not? You know, the trolley problem brings this to mind, but really it's the whole, like, you know, I could just frame it as, you know, what does one life matter to 5 to 10 to 20 to 100 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 350 million people in America to 7 billion people in the world? You know, it's pretty nuts that we ever came to think that we mattered at all. You know, and I think, and then you wonder, okay, is that a psychological need? Because it seems so. When we have when the point of a civilization is to make itself permanent, right, to fight against the entropy and the decay of life, it seems to me we're saying, yes, the collective is more important, because it has to be. You know, like, but yet at the same time, if the individual within the collective shirks their duty, then what kind of collective are you left with?
Mm-hmm.
Right. That to me, so to me, it's a question of how the two are navigated. And it's like, in reality, there's no such thing as the perception of a mass. There is a perception of the individual, though. Like, what's a perception of the mass? Like, they don't have a singular eyesight. They don't actually have a singular will. They can amass what looks like a singular will. I mean, like, look at America and Afghanistan. Like, what was the collective? Like, what was that will? That will looked suicidal. That will look like, oh, well, we gave up. That will look like, well, all this shit we said mattered, and all that resources we spent, like, well, it just doesn't matter. We didn't care enough to win the war. what was even the win condition? So like, and I guess you could apply this to the collective and say, okay, well, what's the collective's win condition? What are they actually saying? What are they actually up to? Why would you even want to be a part of that group? That, you know, for an individual, specifically those philosophically inclined, it's like, I think the answer becomes very obvious.
What would you say the answer is?
Oh, well, okay, so I guess I think of like guys like Emerson and then Nietzsche, because I mentioned it to you, there's no Nietzsche without Emerson, or at the very least, there's a very different Nietzsche without Emerson, because in his essay Self-Reliance, you know, you can just see kernel after kernel of Nietzsche, and it's just call and answer, call and answer, call and answer, like music, really, right? Like you see that in philosophy a lot, right? You see that really in most intellectual and artistic fields, you know, call and answer, and sometimes it can be from music to art, or from music to literature, or literature to music, right? You see that kind of thing too, the way culture feeds into each other. But Emerson says, it's a question of why, because it otherwise seems counterintuitive, because if the notion is we're collective, yeah, why would you want to distinguish yourself from it? And it's like, well, our philosophical timeline took us in this direction in the belief of the individual, yet to the degrees that people, like, you've heard people say things like liberalism has failed, and I'm sure you've heard that sort of thing. And it's like, no, actually, it's been wildly successful. It's been so successful, it's rendered itself like schizophrenic in its urges and its desires and its values. Because like when your values are notions of freedoms and rights, and you perpetuate that myth in perpetuity, like you're left with our modern day conditions. Again, like if we're a decadent nation, it means all these problems were inevitable. When we were founded in, like, it's like, boom, democracy, there's a unique set of problems. Boom, Christianity, there's a unique set of problems. Boom, revolution, there's a unique set of problems. Slavery, there's a unique set of problems. We're seeing all that stuff come to a head. So the question that people are asking right now, they're not just asking what's the ideal system and way to organize ourselves. They're also asking, less so with the collectivists, but it's in there. They're actually asking, what's the ideal man? And it's a question that we have to square up with sooner or later. You know what I mean? Like if we're not actually looking at that, because again, the philosopher is there to shape men. So if a philosopher misses that point, then they don't understand their own job position, and I'd argue they're not philosophers or something else. They could be an artist, they could be any number of things, but a philosopher is a very unique, it's a very specific thing.
Well, I guess two things come to my mind. One is I think a lot of people in modern political discourse, you could say that everyone's a liberal to some degree. They're just they're cherry picking whatever
right
part of liberalism they want, and then they're reputing the other part of it as not actually liberal. Even like
the whole thing's a bit of a straw man in a very real sense, right? Like
exactly.
It's like, no, because most for those of us of the liberal tradition, like I look at most of their critics, like the reason why I will never even do it, because it's like, one, like there's a much better fight to be had, and there's other, like, I think rather than living in the muck of the past, like we move forward, right? We ask the next questions, like, okay, if that's remotely true, what then? Because you guys are still playing around in the muck, right? Like the afterbirth, whatever this abortion of history was, or was supposed to be, or wasn't supposed to be. Either way, that's what they're doing, right? So, like, you see their criticisms, and it's like, well, dude, like, no liberals, like I've been living in this, I've been here for decades, and I've never seen it. Like, no liberal actually thinks that way or thinks that thing, or for the arguments and criticisms on modern liberalism and America and democracy and all these systems, it's like, yeah, a lot of them are just straw men. They, it's more like, to me, it's a shell game, right? It's like, hey, look over here. This is a mask for what we're doing over there. And that's, that's politics, and that's Machiavellianism, and that's a lot of things, right? And I guess this is if we go back to the Nietzschean sense, the Zappian sense, the Jungian sense, this also speaks to why some of the new rational, the proselytizing for rationalism or atheism is just plain silly. Is that, again, if we really are painted puppets, if we are really drunk and childlike and all these things from Heraclitus to the Buddha, right, that we've been asleep at the wheel all this time, then it would tell you that people can't help it anyway. Like they actually can't, like they didn't actually make a choice in this. If we're kind of like animals in a zoo, then they're just reacting, right? Like they're clapped into their own, the prison of their own consciousness. So if they've learned a certain aspect of the liberal tradition, and then to us as outside observers, you might say that looks pathological. And I might say, oh yeah, that looks pathological because it's like they exist within the Western system. They're criticizing the Western system. But then the question is, what's the intention? And not, because I'm not judging them by the fruits and I'm not judging them by intention either. I just mean intention as in be aware of the danger, not as a moral value. Mm-hmm. Because let me ask you, as a younger man, and like I said, I can tell with who's influenced your thought. I could see before we even spoke, I could see you're well on your way in the way that any student could or should be, that I think is going to lead to result. And not that I think, it's more like what education over time proves is that it leads to different understanding, different modes of thought. It changes your mind and your body. It changes your internal sight. And it's a very slow process. So that process in an individual is actually important for anything important to be developed. But not everyone can take it to its apex, right? Not everyone is an apex mind. Not everyone is but it doesn't matter because, again, people have their roles, people have their function. And I don't even mean this in a, it gets real gross to me, like utilitarianism, pragmatism, right? To me, it's really gross because we're not an ant farm, right? We're not blocks of wood who, when you see like the tech, we spoke about, we only mentioned them in passing, but like the technocrats, and you hear it every time you hear someone put forth a master morality, as in they're hiding behind morals. They're using their morality as a claim to their rights, which are, these are our rights at the expense of you. Like you see that with the technocrats, where it's just like, nope, we're going to keep doing this regardless. Like no one voted for us, no one asked for this, no one wanted this. They vote, they can't help themselves but be addicted to the technology. They want it, but their thoughts are, well, we're just going to do it at our discretion and we don't really care what people think. And you see that in their morality, right? You see that. So there's a question of, well, what the hell is this collective, and how much of a collective is it? Is it really a collective, or is it, to me, because to me it's ironic, right? A nation that prides itself on bravery, freedom, and even a certain degree of morality and virtue, to the degrees that America has done what you'd say a lot of good things in the world and developed a lot of good things. It's like, okay, well, when we're all subject to not just the mass forces of a coercive two-party system, but also all the other controls and regulations and rules, it's like, well, if the collective is more important, is this collective more important? Like, does this collective, let me ask you this, does this collective justify itself? Does this collective square its circle? Does it give itself a purpose and a reason to exist? Does it give, you know what I mean? Like, does it answer the problems of existence? Like, does it answer the questions? And if belief is a need to know, does that serve this purpose? Whatever ontology and epistemology and religious thinking they're trying to establish here in politics, in the secular world, in a increasingly secularizing, increasingly, oddly enough, right, at least increasingly surface value liberal America. Like, what do you think? Where do you, because I know you said you're doing the weights and measures yourself, and it's fine, right? Not like you need to come to a conclusion, and to me it's like we are parsing it out, right? Like we're not making a judgment, and we're not making a judgment yet, at least.
Well, I mean, what I think is I think we've gone really too far in our like surface level arguments, whether we actually live this out in practice. But I think individualism.
Oh, sure, that's an important question too. Can you? Yeah, go on.
I think particularly in the United States, this we have the rhetoric of the individual is what matters the most. And it's gone to an absurd, it's gotten to a point which is quite absurd, because what you hear from like a lot of media is like, don't be a sheep, be an individual. And what happens is, if everyone is following that, then everyone's actually being a sheep. You see what I'm
Right.
saying?
Oh, well,
Um,
there's a Nietzsche aphorism, go be yourself, person A, be yourself, be free, person B. Why? Because you said so. It's freaking hilarious, right? Like the self-awareness, like, see, that's the kind of thought where it reminds me of trying to see the back of your head with a mirror, right? Like there's that weird little blind spot there's always that weird little incomplete circuit in our logic. It's almost like, again, if we can't see our origin, we can't see our creator, we can't see the true causes and conditions. To me, that's what human blindness is. It's an inability to see, due to whatever the factors are. So, maybe, the real questions that we should be asking, maybe the most important ones, maybe we haven't even figured out what they are yet in terms of how you would actually organize. But I'll tell you, this is like, the way I see it is that I'm almost like, I think that technology might make the philosopher and look, this was part of Nietzsche's concern, actually, and he expresses it in a number of ways in a number of places throughout the course of his entire works. But there's basically a question of like, like, the way I conceive of it is humanity going extinct without dying off. And I guess that winds up starting to look like an idiocracy world, or more like a Brave New World, where the organizers of the society know that there was a humanity that had like instincts. It was like it's literally the difference between dogs and wolves, because a dog is a intentionally changed wolf who is essentially puppy-like for its entire existence. It never grows up in the way that a wolf pup turns into a wolf. Like, the dog stays a puppy for most of its life, right? It's dumb, it's happy, it's loyal, it wags its tail. And if it's remotely brought up right by its master, it knows it's a slave and it knows it's second in the pack. But it's fine because it operates on the same social hierarchy, technology, bodily wisdom and technology that we do. It's a physiological thing. It's why we can understand dogs. Hell, you could have the same relationship with a rat as you can a dog. And it's like, why? It's like they're both social creatures who operate on the same instinctual uh, nervous system setup and regulation. A lot of the same chemicals, right? A lot of the same reactions, a lot of the same bodily understanding. This is where food comes from. This is where shelter. This is danger. This is this. This is what the master looks like when he's mad. This is what the master looks like when he's sad. Like, they kind of understand those things.
I mean, I think the so you were talking about like, fate and kind of the inevitability of the what we're experiencing now.
Yes.
And I mean, you can trace the supremacy of the individual in our thought process. I mean, you can trace this, quite easily, because again, I mean, I keep bringing up the Enlightenment, but
No, of course.
it goes back to that, because the philosophers, the Enlightenment,
the French were huge.
The French were huge. I mean, because basically, because it's funny, like we associate the Enlightenment with like democracy, but even like the most democratic elements in the Enlightenment, they were like, they still thought of it as a very limited democracy. They still thought of it as like the smart people, the good people.
It was very, very
us,
aristocratic, right?
The intellectuals, right?
Yeah.
The intellectuals were like, we should be free to like write tracts against the king. We should be free to write tracts against the Catholic Church. They didn't care about like the carpenter, or the poor peasant slaving away in the farm. They wanted to freedom, for themselves to express themselves the way they wanted to. But then you get like, the Romanticism, which was the partly a reaction against the Enlightenment, and you get like, the reason Rousseau's Confessions is a really important book is not just because it founded modern autobiography, but because Rousseau's whole point was like, I am, like no one else. I am special. I am unique. I am.
Oh, well, that's what
that's
why Nietzsche criticized Rousseau so much. He says Nietzsche was slapping him down and putting him back in his place, going, he's a pedant who speaks and talks like a nobleman or aristocrat who's been wronged. It's hilarious. Well, and then you heard Voltaire, and Voltaire did the same thing. Like, the fact that Voltaire criticized him tells you that Voltaire knew that he was powerful and dangerous, right? Mm-hmm. But, because Voltaire's I think he said, of Rousseau. He's like, he wants him to get back on he wants man to get back on four legs. And I guess Rousseau does echo that return to the wolf. And, but why you return to the wolf is because you're resentful of those who would try to turn you into a dog. And it's understandable, go figure, for all of history, slaves don't want to be slaves. Yet due to their attitudes and the way that they've been enslaved, usually the masters would look at them and be like, well, look at them, they're enslaved. Of course they're slaves. If they weren't meant to be slaves, we wouldn't have been able to enslave them, right? It's a very like matter of like that kind of logical thinking that defined, you could say, higher men or the upper class or whatever it is for all of history. Like it's on a full display for everyone to see, and a guy like Rousseau comes along, and he's mad about it. He can't accept it. He wants to revolt. But and then, like you said, yet at the same time, the intellectuals, it's like they had the same thought, but they're like, no, but like there's a way to do it, and there's a people who can do it, and it's not you. Right?
Rousseau was more willing to say we need to like go back to the drawing board and he was more of the revolutionary, although yes. He wasn't really. I mean, the people, the people in the French Revolution, I think they exaggerated even Rousseau's idea of revolution, because in many ways Rousseau was far more conservative than Robespierre and Danton right. and all those guys. But whereas the philosophers that from whom Rousseau ultimately broke, they were more concerned with reform, because again they were concerned with sort of the small, like what we know as like civil liberties now. They were concerned with like gaining civil liberties for themselves, as well as a certain
it's their will to power, right? It's Nietzsche would say this is their will to power, and he classified philosophers as Schopenhauerian. These are the pessimists, and these are probably, you would say, modern pessimists, including the nihilists. And then you have the Rousseauians. These are the revolutionaries. These are a lot of your Marxists and your communists, right? Socialists, they fall into this category. There's the Goetheans, right? And with them, those are like your various, like Game of Thrones, Varys and Littlefinger. I think they're the best modern examples. It's just it's the guy whispering in the king's ear. It's the guy who's funding causes and contributing to causes and encouraging causes, but he's not, unlike Rousseau, he's not waving the banner and doing the blatant carrying and revolting himself, right? He's just he's got the power in the background. And then I guess in the modern day, Nietzsche didn't add himself, but we're adding it, and now there's the Nietzschean. And I don't, and I guess I would call, if you wanted to add the postmodern, it's like, nah, that's a subsect from Nietzsche, right? He was a progenitor, he was their progenitor. Like he was like pretty much all modern philosophy. Like if a modern philosopher doesn't have Nietzsche in there somewhere, or if it doesn't make room for it, then they're either lying or, right? You know what I mean? Like,
or they're looking for a pre-Nietzschean philosophy. They're trying to go back before Nietzsche.
No, that's all well. Like, look, I'll say this. I'm gonna differentiate, because look, Nietzsche said, "This is mine. Where's yours?" So of course, like he invites us all to write our own gay science. That's all well and good. I'm not like, that is the Nietzschean. It's got a bit of all of them in there, right? Because it has the understanding of the pessimist, it has the understanding of the Christian, it has the understanding of all that stuff, right? Pretty much, it takes into itself everything that came before, as well as being open to what comes after. And I guess the concerns on the individual and the collection, to bring it back home, is, okay, what's the modern day philosopher's concern? It's like, well, to me, it's still the same as Nietzsche's concern, is like, well, we could become the ghosts in the machine. That the only way to control and organize us past a certain volume is to literally just maybe it is to put collars and chip us. Like, I don't know, maybe that is because we get so wild and like untenable, and because a government and a God and a culture and a people can no longer get along or contain so many mutually hostile forces. Maybe it does wind up that we just have to keep going further and further in the Brave New World / 1984 direction, because that's the CCP. They have Skynet. It's like, you got all your digital, like, you don't need the NSA. You have Skynet. Skynet will take care of it. You have a police force to react to it. But other than that, you don't even need an organization like the NSA with something like that, It's like it catches everyone and everything anyway. It can recognize faces. It recognizes what feelings you're having, because if you don't look happy, that's a red flag. And we, why is it a red flag if you're not happy? Well, malcontent people are often bad for, like, the most dangerous thing for civilization through history, what it's been? A bunch of hungry, unemployed people with a lack of something to do. Like, you think, like in ancient Egypt, you got to imagine the importance of, or in any ancient culture, like building things was always important for civilization, for a king, but also to the people. It's like, what was that? It's like, well, you might not believe in the legitimacy of a god or a ruler, but when he's making, whether he pays you or not, when he's making you slave away to build this larger in life thing that's going to last, it's everything about it. It makes you seem small and nothing like that's got to have a profound effect on the psyche. And Emerson talks about this too. And actually, we're about to do the fourth part on that essay here in the end of the absurd podcast. But there's this part in there where Emerson says it's like the towers and structures and everything around within a culture ask the individual, and what do you have, or what can you do, or what do you have to show? Right? It's almost like a challenge. That the whole, again, what's the point of a civilization in a culture? And it's like, ideally, it's to perpetuate itself, to create more of the same, right? Because this is a pattern in nature. Like, stars seem to repeat themselves, right? They keep birthing themselves. And I don't, there's, without, we can't say there's a cause, or, you know what I mean? Like the unmoved mover, you get into that kind of stuff, right? Like, I'm not going to get into any of that, but what we see is that accretion happens in space due to a number of forces, and these patterns seem to play out, and it's observable, and we would say empirical, right? To the point that we can run calculations and figure so much of this stuff out.
It might pay, or it pays to at least to some degree, to think about society as like an organism, in the same way that organisms, in the same way that species try to pass on their genes, yeah.
But again, to me, it's like, to say that the best, at the end of the day, the best part about okay, as a philosopher, what I see best in us, it's our potential. It's the wild card we are. It's the reason why a student is important. It's like, yes, he might be a philosopher, he might be a social scientist, he might be a plumber, right? At some point in his career, but it doesn't matter, because regardless, you don't know how important their work might be. This is why Western education, to the degree that it invites students in, this is the best thing about it. The worst thing about it is it's like a giant ant farm kind of system, to where it can't distinguish intelligence, genius, or creativity. It'll put you in learning disability. It'll put the entire nation in learning disability. It's so bad at this kind of stuff. To bring it back around to our earlier points in the importance of education, because look, I'm a strong proponent, and I think and I can tell you are too. And I can tell you've been learning from arguably the best, because that's who we look to, right? Like, I guess when people criticize a lot of Western culture and stuff, it's like, yeah, it's low-hanging fruit. We go for the people go for the easiest, the obvious, the stupid. And it's like, well, again, but nobody actually holds that up. Like, that's clearly a mistake or a mishap. Like, where it's like, what are the actual values? And it's like, well, I'm thinking wisdom, and I'm thinking ethos, and I'm thinking, I guess if we are going to play the role of system and political thinkers, then we also have to consider utilitarian and pragmatism to a degree, but also what's long-term good for the human psyche. And I mean, the human psyche is like something that is not static and rigid. It's not a block of wood that can just be carved eternally. So, because we are subject to internal and external forces, including each other, including, our understanding of epigenetics has changed enough to where, even though we don't believe in Lamarckian evolution, we've demonstrated that it's not as written stone as we say, because we know that a species isn't, it might fall into a rut that dooms it, but at the same time, it changes over time to adapt. So it's like that, again, that's what we're trying to harness and focus on if we're intelligent, I would say. Right? Like, to me, this is why Nietzsche comes to mind. I could ask you, how did he know how to contact us future men? How did he know what to write that we would understand him? And regardless of what your answers would be, I would say he didn't. He chose he set a standard, and he chose it on his terms. And he didn't know how stupid we would be. He didn't know how ignorant we would be. He didn't know how far our heads up our asses would be. But there was a question of, well, when and how could we understand him? And what we know now is that we did come to understand him, even though arguably it's like often poorly at best, and half-assedly and not completely. You could criticize, any number of things, but it's besides the point. I'm just demonstrating that for when it comes to wisdom, and because you can't lie about certain things, right? There's certain things you can't hide, you can't lie about them. Like if it's in you, it's going to come out. If you're about it, you're going to give yourself away, certain things like that, right? That we are not as camouflaged as we think we are, right? We're not as clever liar, or that it's the evolutionary arms race maybe of the liar or the philosopher and those who would criticize or try to understand. Because I'm just thinking specifically here even of just psychoanalytic, right? Psychoanalytics period. Or, when we could do any number of branches from, what we would say is pathology, mass pathology, or even criminology, right? Because I've studied all this stuff for years and at length, both in the field and otherwise.
Well, I mean, I think Nietzsche.
So it's a complex soup for sure. But go on.
I think Nietzsche, along with most like philosophers and writers, I mean, you can never be certain, like when that you're properly communicating with other people. And you can never be fully certain that your ideas are going to be conveyed, that they're going to understand, what you're saying, why you're saying it, how you're saying it.
Well, he gatekept it though, right? He intentionally didn't go like, okay, here's X, Y, Z, B, A, right? Like he's like he made an art out of it, and then he hermetically sealed it. And it comes out in some of his writing where he talks about himself like the need or desire to be both understood and misunderstood. There's a reason and a time to do both.
Oh, exactly. I mean, and then there's that anecdote I think I learned from one of Keegan's podcasts about, I think he came across, was it a group of nuns or on his travels or something? And, they asked him, they found out he wrote books, and they asked him, well, what book of yours should we read? And he said something to the effect of, you shouldn't read my books. They're not for you.
Right.
Please
no,
don't.
no.
Please don't read your books. Please stay.
No, and I don't think he didn't want to antagonize them. That wasn't his purpose, right? Like he didn't want to just antagonize them. And but he also talks about, he says he also writes sometimes that he's perfectly happy when some of these old maids and donkeys completely misinterpret his work and think it means something else, or you really apply more morality to it. I can't remember the exact sentiment, the exact words, but a little bit of the exact sentiment. And it's like, he talks about that too, that, he kind of accounts for, again, then that was part of his genius, that he just accounted for so much that you go, my God, for all of history, most people didn't even mention this. If they were aware of it, they didn't say so. And that's part of what Nietzsche also lauded Socrates. He says it's not just what he says, it's what he didn't say. Because how much more did Socrates know that he didn't say? Because his own philosophy was to understand, okay, how do I, the philosopher's conundrum is always the same. It's how do I relate myself? How do I communicate myself? That will never change, because inevitably if you're occupying that position, then there's a distance between you and everyone else. It goes with the territory. It's incontrovertible and unavoidable. If you're a philosopher of the people, you're not a philosopher, at least not in the way that you might think of what a quote unquote philosopher of the people is. That's not a, to me, it's the bigger picture. It's the bigger shaping. It's the bigger, course of things, and I think it coalesced in Nietzsche better than anyone else, because to my mind, to best describe it and be like, well, the differences between him and the men of the past is what makes him different, is that he didn't lie about it. He did his best to relate it honestly, at least in the sense that, hey, look, I made a discovery, rather than hiding behind the church or a God or a spiritual system, or here's my way and you must replicate it and you must follow. He's like, no, these are the lines I'm drawing. And if you look at them, it's like, it's like Thoreau over by Walden. It's like, why would you draw a line over there? No, like people are, out of everything people are concerned about now in the modern age, they're definitely not, their minds and thoughts and feelings are not where yours are, but they come to be where yours are, because the philosopher actually comes first. So to give you an example, Hermann Hesse writes in between war, because Hermann Hesse, he was a novelist, and he was a Nietzschean himself, right? But he he understood the profundity of it. And in between World War I and World War II, you know, and he fought as or he was a medic in World War I, if I recall correctly, like Hemingway, right? So it affected him profoundly. And then in between World War I and World War II, it's in the book Steppenwolf. He brings up this anecdote and he says, look, like he's talking about modern suffering, modern nihilism, modern God. You know, he's talking about these things, and I don't remember the exact words he's using, but the sentiment is what I remember. And he says, you know, Nietzsche came to understand, see, thus feel and suffer these things, like, you know, basically 50 years, you know, 40 to 50 years in advance of everyone else. How many now suffer as him? So now here we are even further later. And I would ask you, how many people suffer as he did? You know, and I mean that whether it leads to anything or not, you know, because for Nietzsche, it arguably paid off. You know, he came up with the formulation that worked to hit for him, you know, lest he be crushed by what it was that he dealt with. And, you know, people would still might argue like, oh, with his mental illness, maybe he was. And, you know, that's too much speculate. Like, it's besides the point to me.
Well, I mean, another anecdote from not Nietzsche's life, but
Sure.
Voltaire's life. There's a short story of his. I've forgotten the name of it now, but anyway, the short story consists of, I think, like a young man who goes to like talk to a philosopher, and the philosopher is like, the young man finds the philosopher distraught, and so he's like, well, what's wrong? And the philosopher's like, you know, I'm you know, I'm ashamed of myself, you know, because there's no point to all this philosophy, and I you know, I claim to know more than I do, and when I make arguments to people, I'm, you know, horrified by my own arguments because they're nonsense, and I'm just he's kind of the, I sort of see that as like, you know, a subtle confession of, you know, of
Yeah.
Voltaire's. He's almost saying like,
Yes.
all this thinking is wearing me out. And I mean, at the conclusion of the story, you know,
well, I think Nietzsche would probably call that either a moment of weakness, or that philosopher is still stuck in weakness. But I get it that it doesn't have to be that. It could just be that he's using it as a parable to, like, just like Nietzsche used the madman. Like, you know, the famous story of the madman, right? And the madman says, yes, I've come too early. That's such an absurd thing to say. It's like, no, Nietzsche, you were actually right on time. You were so right on time that no one could understand you. Thus, it's always been, right? Like, again, resist not evil is just as out of place today as it was 2,000 years ago. Turn the other cheek is just as out of place today as it is 2,000 years ago. That is not animal nature. Like, ask the rattlesnake, ask the water buffalo. You know, they'll destroy you if you get too close. Like, it's there, whether we want to be honest about it or not. But I mean, that's a you know, it's otherwise a brilliant little, you know, as both a subtle, you know, as a subtle confession, as well as to a parable just to tell a story. You know, it's brilliant.
Well, and what happens next is then the young man goes to the philosopher's neighbor, and I think the philosopher's neighbor is like a Hindi woman, right, who's like totally ignorant of all philosophy and pretty much ignorant about everything, but she just is a devout Hindu, and she's like very, very happy. She's like extremely happy. And so the young man then goes back to the philosopher and says, like, why are you tormenting yourself with all this philosophy when this woman who's totally ignorant is extremely happy? And then the philosopher's like, well, you know, the unexamined life is not worth living, et cetera, et cetera. But the short story is interesting in my mind because it really never, it just shows the two sides of the debate. And it doesn't really, Voltaire never outright says, it never puts in really the characters' mouths like this is the final answer to
right.
this debate.
It sounds like he's not saying it's right or wrong, good or bad, praise or blame. It's, at least in this context, because, you know, he was a moral philosopher, right? It goes with the territory, Christianity, Enlightenment, right? It's part of our evolution in our culture, in our society, and also our socialization, right? But yeah,
but it's a debate. It's a debate that I think a lot about because
right. But I think it's a question of, can she help herself believe just as much as can he help himself but question? You know, to me, it's like, that's the difference. It's like, it winds up being a matter of our wills to the degrees that, okay, regardless of what you might question was self-chosen in you or shaped by others, it's like, well, regardless of how we might parse that over time, it's like, here you are at this point in time, and this is where you've wound up. It's like, could you turn around? Could you change that? Does it seem like you're going to stop now? You know, could you just go, okay, I'm going to believe in God, see everybody, Like, I'm not going to use my brain anymore.
Well, there was a time in my teens, like around 16-ish or so, I was just like kind of really depressed. I won't get to go into too much
Well, look,
detail, but
if you were depressed in modern America in the modern age, I'd be like, well, welcome home, man. Like, welcome to the party.
but I bring it up because I was thinking at the moment I was like, I really want to believe, like I really want to like become a Christian. I really want to truly like believe and
See,
like
that is heartbreaking, man. Oh, you wanted to believe.
but I what I realized ultimately was I can't believe. It's
Right,
impossible for me.
right. You wanted to, but see, to me, but that's an important distinction.
The cat is out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle. It's I
Yes,
can't
yes.
return to
No,
the
see,
to my state of
you're a modern,
ignorance
right?
when I was like 5 or 10.
See, you're too much up on the gay science already. It's well, I mean, it's true. We again, like, did we come this far to like start moving backwards or backwards, sideways, and people's notions of forward? It's all, you look at it and it's like in the modern day, you see that it's asinine. You see like, oh, it's more of the same. And whereas Nietzsche, I go back to Zarathustra, and it's like, despite him saying a breaker is a creator and that they get crucified for good reasons, he also says it's necessary. He lauds it. He does it himself. He plays Socrates himself. Every profound philosopher, regardless, it's like, at least in Western tradition, it's like they're channeling Socrates to a degree. Like it's unavoidable. And I guess Nietzsche talks about it in Genealogy of Morality, right? Like the issue though becomes that, especially with this revolutionary liberal nations, is that the moment a new ideal or order is established, like right away, like before you even breathe a sigh of relief for something having been created or like surviving, like people are already working against it. People turn around like a minute later and they're just surreptitiously, here we are scheming again. We're gonna fight the power. We're gonna tear down the government. We're gonna secure liberty. And it's like, well, liberty for what? Liberty so people can believe if they want to believe, or not believe if they can't believe. Like the whole thing winds up being I guess it is very snake eating its own tail. It seems that way to me, at least, because when I look to America, it's like I see it as the liberals are the young Christian cult reverting to its infancy, and the conservatives are the old cruel Romans. The modern Christians despise the cruelty of the Romans, right? Because Christ was very sensitive and he didn't want anyone to suffer, and he just wanted everything soft and nice, right? The dream world he was spinning was just, like, oh, you're going to live there and you're going to live there forever in eternity. And it's like, to me, it's like, while there's the Dionysian element of subverting what already exists coming out from the unconscious soil behind it all, right? Like the future comes from the past, like the future sneaks up from behind us, right? The Jews and the Romans, like they didn't see that coming. They should, in theory, if they knew their philosophy, they should have, but they didn't, right? And like to this day, people still don't see it coming, even though I think history creates a pattern and I think we can tell where it's going. So like at present, I think we're on a downturn, and other people have put this forth too, right? Like regardless of whether you want to call it a civil war, it is an eternal, it is an eternal recurrence, at least in the meantime, because we have not freed ourselves from vengeance. The problem with the Enlightenment is the problem with Christianity is that we're still perpetuating the same mythos. We're still believing in revenge. We're still teaching the children revenge, even to teach them to be revolutionary activists. You're actually just saying, hey, see this system, look at what it's not giving you, look what it's failed to give you. You should resent it. You should change it. And it's like, as a simple analysis, it's not wrong, because like, look, man, if we're going to be friends, it implies a certain reciprocity. But if I'm actually not, if we're taking the time and you're offering me hospitality and I'm not doing the same, it's like, well, that's pretty shitty, like, why would you put up with that? That's just, I think that's a huge fundamental human nature, and kids pick up on that kind of practical, we'll call it a practical morality real quickly. And I don't think we have to call it a morality. I think it's a practical hierarchy. It's part of hierarchy, because no matter where people organize, a hierarchy comes into play, whether it's a game or a business, let's say. These are all, again, realities. And no matter how much positivists and, idealist liberals want to put these ideas forward, it's just like, again, history and all these things show us to the contrary. Like I would also too, like if you've ever heard of or seen the X-Files, the line is, I too would also like to believe, or I want to believe. And it's like, yes, but however, the X-Files was a long time ago. David Duchovny ain't so young and handsome anymore. Things like that. And that's a lot of liberal politics and liberal values. You see it. It's like, oh, these are like, this is still good. This is still good. That's a little bit rotten. That one's a complete mummy. It's just so desiccated, right? Like there's nothing left of it. And I think that notion of like this, but these cycles of rot, decay, institutional corruption, it's like, dude, these have always been problems. And again, so far it seems like they at least so long as we're operating on this physiology and these feelings, it seems like it's going to stay a problem until we actually somehow are changed. And to me, it seems like that changing is falling into the hands, like people aren't even choosing this. It's just what's happening. And that I think those changes are falling into the hands of algorithm, which means the most mass powerful forces to ever exist, media and governments, that are just two parts of many mass forces that shape modern mass people. Mass in the Jungian sense being they're influenced by mass forces, not that they're mass manufactured, but that's the impression we get, right? Is that people are mass manufactured because when you see how similarly the process shapes us all, right? At least to the degrees that we wind up similar and like indistinguishable from each other, and that's the collective, right? Like the point of a culture and a civilization is to create a collective because it has these repressionistic mechanisms that allow us to exist and occupy a same space. But it becomes a problem if we distance ourselves too much and can no longer occupy the same space or similar space or even nearby space because travel's become so simple, right? Like I think the people used to be able to insulate themselves better. Maybe I can't tell I think they can insulate themselves better now, right? Because it was probably easier for the peasants to get into the castle than it is for, the peasants to track down where some technocrats, many mansions are located because they can just come and go at will, right? They have the utmost freedom.
Well, I'm reminded of, I don't know if you're familiar with Edward Bernays.
Go on.
So Edward Bernays was the Sigmund Freud's nephew. But he was really one of the he's considered the father of public relations, and he was really one of the first people who wanted to use advertising. He figured out like there's a psychological trick to advertising.
Oh, right.
And persuading people to buy your products or persuading people to vote for this or that candidate, right? Salesmanship.
Didn't it just make you feel gross already now that we're heading in this direction?
Well, exactly. I mean, before that kind of advertisers are really trying to sell things based on utility. So you should buy this product because it's actually going to help you in this way. But now advertising is about appealing to your desires, appealing to your
want to be sexy, want to be cool,
exactly. I mean, he literally.
Are you tired of being such a piece of shit? Are you tired of being afraid all the time? Are you tired of sucking?
One of Bernays' first projects was trying to increase, try to get people to smoke. And what he did, trying to get women to smoke. Excuse me, trying to get women to smoke.
Society. How do we target the pregnant women demographic?
What he did when he, wanting to get women to smoke was he tied it with women's liberation. He was like, no, don't
do as you're told.
The liberated woman, the free woman, the independent woman is the woman that smokes cigarettes, right? And so, I mean, who knows, like the countless lives
that were, because I say so.
Who knows the countless lives that were lost because of that one move that he did.
Well, see, this is a funny thing. I have a lot of criticism of the modern psychological field, especially the practitioners, because like no one can ever I've never had one of them tell me honestly like, oh yeah, psychology was born under the dark star of decadence. It's actually a product of decadence. It's actually a product of decline. It came into being of necessity because we were creating so much garbage in humanity. Like we were creating so many problems and neuroses, and we can't say it's only because of X, Y, and Z of our, I would say our philosophical, religious, civilizational timeline, right? Like it's not just because of that, but we see what we do create there. And we can see that in other cultures and places, they don't create as much mental illness. And where it manifests, it usually doesn't manifest as violently and as commonly. So there is something to, our mythos and our pathos and our ethos that really is, makes the mind fertile for insecurity and paranoia. And, my understanding is a lot of it is Christianity. A lot of it is our course of history that has shaped us. So, because we have had to be so paranoid about what other people think of us. And because we have had to, like we could have been a more quiet collectivist type, but like Christianity brought out the individual. So we wound up like, we're supposed to somehow, like, I think we have a lot of that two bodies and one soul, or two souls in one body, where we have both a master morality and a slave morality. And to the degrees that modern Americans have problems with ethics and issues, this is why. It's because there's no actual coherent philosophy or morality that has shaped them. It's because it's now created, it seems like you could bring out the best of both worlds and and I think of Nietzsche like that, or the worst of both worlds. Because Nietzsche has criticism for pragmatism, for utilitarianism, for the because he, on one side, he champions suffering and people being inflicted with suffering by oppressors, because that's what shapes us. On the other hand, he also says, like, man, it's been a lot of squander and stupidity, and a lot of this exploitation has bit everyone in the ass, and it's chafed everyone's ass. Obviously he doesn't use those words, but something like that.
Well, I was just reminded of Renee's because you were talking about
oh sure, no, it's the modern, again, it's like Jung being used to like a lot of his formulations being used in online dating and other algorithms, yes. That like we just keep taking everything from the past winds up being channeled through the lowest common denominator. And it's like, why? It's like, well, because the most fundamental material aspects of our society seem to be the strongest, because we put more value, we're still more materialistic than not, I think, and the proof is in the pudding, right? And I default to a guy like Sitting Bull, who could see through us. When the Americans got here, he saw through us. He says, look, they have a religion where the poor and the slaves, they believe, they worship, they pay money to the rich. The rich don't believe, don't go to church, don't pay anything. They do as they please. They fence the poor people off amongst each other. Like that, he could see that shows you how sophisticated his eyesight was, that he could, having only recently come into not recently, because he would have grown up with it, because by then you're in the 1800s and stuff, right? So Europeans had been in the Americas for a while, right? But at the same time, for hundreds of years. But what I mean is that he could see through that with, again, Nietzsche was, I think by the time Sitting Bull even said that, Nietzsche, I don't remember what point in Nietzsche's career is, but yeah, I don't even think he was finished, right? So this guy could have a Nietzschean take on what you could call a Nietzschean take, which is, I think, of just an eyesight that can testing thought that can dissolve anything down. That's what a Nietzschean sight is to me. It's a testing thought that quickly gets to the heart of the matters, in analytics and otherwise, to estimate or to try and understand human behavior and human psychology. But he said that, and the other profound thing he said is, had him, that he could say it back then, Sitting Bull, that is, he said that, it could have been twice as big and it still wouldn't have been enough. He saw that hunger and greed in us Westerners back then. And it seemed, and like, you tell me, it looks like to me, it says a lot that he could call it like that and that he was correct. Because everyone likes to give it lip service. And it's like, again, all these people, the wealthiest people in this society, it's like, dude, they are the institutions. They are the government. They are the 1%, if you will, right? It's their terminology. Yet they sell it like they're the revolutionary selling their revolutionary ideas through the institutions. And it has everything to do with this mass marketing, right? Of like how to best, it's used in advertising, and also government is no different. Like how to best, it's like it's not how to win friends and influence people. It's just like how to manipulate these logs, how to get these pawns on the chessboard to where you want them. It takes no account. Like there's something called the general welfare, but there can never be a mat welfare, right? Because the system just can't care about you. You asked about the difference between the individual and the collective. And unfortunately, it's kind of that the collective can't care about the individual. It's why intelligent people wind up in learning disability. It's why, it's why ghettos and trailer parks, it's why poor white and black people en masse have suffered in this country for hundreds of years under an oligarchic class who's just increasingly completely missing in action. And I'm not saying they have to do great things, build great public works and fund everyone's mishaps and adventures through, other systems. But what's clear is you need a certain level of responsibility and accountability of leadership, because otherwise, how can anyone have faith in leadership? It's best to, I just, cut and dry say it's best exemplified in the military. You could also say it's exemplified in philosophy, because the closest thing to a philosopher is the warrior. It's why Nietzsche even says something like truth is a woman and she loves only a warrior, because it does take a suicidally brave attitude. It takes a warrior's trance to see through it, because otherwise you're going to be cut down along the way. And when I say warrior's trance, I mean, I'm sure you felt it before, where you felt so focused or honed in or dialed in that like time in existence even ceases to being in the course of your activity. It's like, the utmost attention, and it's a bit Zen, I suppose. And, it's been classified and organized, and B Encounter has been trying to systematize this understanding of physiology and mind for a long time. But to me, it's like, it's nothing special. It's kind of like brain body connection, bodily wisdom, and the fact that as creatures whose lives are on the line, we have this very refined like eyesight. And it's just a matter of utilizing that as like one of our primary senses, and then how it affects the rest of our senses.
Well, another reason why I despise the Democratic Party is they're really selling like a certain mentality to these poor white and black people. It's like
it's the opportunity cost of it too, because it's not gonna, like, here's my thoughts. Yeah, in another few decades, when the ghettos and trailer parks are being burnt down again, whatever it is, like, what's the excuse then? Where was everybody, right? Because this is what we've seen this before. We've been here before. We've had riots. We've had police shooting. Like, this has technically always been ongoing. It never technically stopped. If anything, we've only built a larger prison system since then. If anything, our school system has only gotten dumber and less and it's not teaching Americans to, especially in the public education, to be competitive individuals. It's like, yeah, smart people stand a chance, and people from good families and wealthy families stand a chance in the sense that they can afford a better education, and they can keep their, again, it's the stratification to where even if you're born poor, through education, you can stratify yourself. But then that means you're not staying in the ghetto. You're not staying in the trailer park. You're getting the fuck out of Dodge, because life at the bottom in America is hateful. And all these wealthy people who come from privileged places, who yet use that word itself as the irony, right, to try and sell it to the poor people. It's like, no, technically you're doing what the French aristocracy did during their revolution, where they offered their heads up on a platter by an excess of liberality, dumbass. Like, they have no idea the devil that they're summoning. They have no idea the damage that they've done, and they kind of know. And for the evil ones, and I mean evil ones in the Nietzschean sense, not in a good and evil sense, just in the sense that there are plenty of psychopaths and sociopaths who take pleasure in destruction and hurting others. Like, they've always existed, as far as I can tell, right, in history as a phenomenon. But so you have a few of those in there, and the rest of it, like anything else, it's a blind will, and you can't really judge it as good and evil, because it's like, nope, this is what they've always done. It's reactive. It's like the left term or the liberal term for, I think it's a propagandistic term for conservative thought, is always neo-reactionary, or as Nietzsche said over 100 years ago, they'll see this as atavistic. They always see a return or a pointing to or a mention of old values and old ideals as atavistic, because we are fooled ourselves with this notion of progress. And like and then it's more absurd to think like, oh, we can't consider maybe some things are so bad we shouldn't even talk about them, consider them, or say them. And then it's like, well, how weak or bad is your philosophy and your thinking in your own mind if you can't even? To me, it's like, thou protest. What's the exact line? Thou protest too much. It's suspicious. Mm-hmm. Is another way of saying it. anytime anyone says don't look here, don't look there, it's like, oh nope. Like
That's
to me, I
that's
mean,
exactly where you look.
yeah, and right in these days, like you said, we I can't remember how you worded it, but basically along the lines of, as modern philosophers and modern thinkers, it's like, dude, we've come too far. Yeah, and I guess it's you. It seemed like, and I think I can admit, like I was there too at one point in time when I was younger, where I was kind of on that seesaw of belief where I wanted to believe, because I saw a relevance of what I'll call religious rapture, and nowadays what I call scientific or philosophical rapture. It's like, to me, the feeling is the same. You can channel it a number of ways, and you can gain access to it a number of ways. It doesn't even have to, and it's not always a thinking activity either, right? Like we're talking feelings, we're talking physiology, but there's more than one way to access it. But again, we've just come too far in that domain. But here, check it out. It's been awesome, but I just realized what have we been in, about almost 3 hours here? Is that right?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, I mean, because look, I would say this. I hope you don't edit anything other than maybe the break or whatever else.
Not at all.
Not at all. Yeah, because it's like, I get it. Sometimes it's like maybe you might get some static or feedback, something like that. I might I get, but it's also a lot to edit, and I guess maybe it helps production value to catch some of the stuff, but it just, it doesn't matter. This is like anything else, right? We know that this will appeal to a certain people and a certain type of person. And that's like, I guess, look, if you earlier, when you asked about the individual and the collective, well, I'd say this is philosopher mediates between the two. He understands the need of the two and the mutual need of the two to each other, right? Or at least that should be his goal, is to understand that, to thus understand the best ethos that works behind it. And then for you, I guess, in questions of your future and where you're going and what you want to do, right, your desires, your whim, your will, it's a question of like, well, who shit, I had the perfect thought, because now I'm going to say, it's going to sound wrong. I wasn't going to say who to appeal to or even how to appeal to. But really, at the end of the day, it is your discretion. It's for, I would say, first and foremost, your benefit, because again, we've come too far for you or any other man, any other modern, at least modern, savvy, sophisticated mammal, to throw their life away or repress your life away in the way that we see is unsatisfactory to modern, rigorous, not just, I'll call it intellectual standard, and I also call it spiritual standard, to the degree that I reference spirit as the feelings of physiology, i.e. the mind in the body. The fact that the nervous system runs throughout the body, our gut produces a large part of our serotonin, right? The mind is the body. Like there's no separation in that. We made that, like we separated ourselves under what, an erroneous conclusion, kind of, however you want to term it.
I mean, I think that really goes back to, and this is a whole other rabbit hole, which we don't have to go into, since we're
sure. Or we could always do it another day.
It goes back to the self. So the division between mind and body, I think it really boils down to kind of our belief in this abstract self, which is like, I mean, it really goes back to the idea of the soul, but now we just have a secular version of the soul, and that's the self.
Right. And let me ask you this. It's tragic though, right? The notion that it has to be redeemed or that it has to live forever. Like we're not, like what it tells me of human psychology, we're not okay with just being. And we're not okay with, like, even then, like that notion of being a worker among workers. Maybe it's why Americans have a hard time with collectivism. It's why I see a lot of, like, it's funny because for being both collectivist and individual tendencies, I see it like they both look about as equally half-assed to me. Because, in America, it's like you're expected to do a bit of both, because part of our values are esteeming a self. Yet a self has no place in a collective because it's going to get in the way. So it's kind of funny, I was going to say oxymoron, but I think we usually pronounce it oxymoron. But oxymoron sounds kind of dumb, and I like the sound of oxymoron. But enough with my linguistic babble there.
Well, I guess I was just going to add before we wrap up.
Yeah.
I do think the pursuit of philosophy always has been and always will be a minority pursuit.
Yes.
I think there will always be people who don't understand, I guess, the appeal of philosophy, or don't understand why anyone would want to study philosophy.
Sure.
I mean, I've had those conversations with people who say, "Oh, philosophy is just entirely pointless." Matthew, why are you talking about this?
Oh, yeah.
I don't care.
It just depends on the person, man.
It depends on the person. Yeah, I mean, certain people, something sparks in them. When I was
right, well, you know the biggest difference between the philosopher and the artist, and I'm not saying a philosopher is an artist, but the main difference between, let's say, a philosopher and an artist of a particular medium, like a painter or a singer, do you know what the main difference is?
Well, go ahead.
So I guess it relates, you've heard Keegan mention the Gardens of Gethsemane, right? And how Nietzsche brings up that question of, the thinker and the artist. And it's like, well, the reason why the thinker can't ask the artist to stay up with them is because the artist has to depart for the dream. The thinker says, I'm dwelling here and now, I'm seeing what's before me. And then I guess we criticize them to the degree that we see, oh, they were actually trying to create a new false world, right? They're trying to get away again. And then again, it brings up the question of like, well, what's so tragic and so bad about existence that people have been seeking escape clauses? Because in the West, the notion has been, even outside of, because even without the religious connotation, and this is, I guess, keep it going a little bit longer because it's important, even without the religious connotation within the West, that notion of the self, even removed from the religious substrate, it still almost implies that there's a self that can wing free of the body. It implies the belief that the self is separate from the body, or that the self has precedence over the body even, or that the self has autonomy over the body. And again, as modern thinkers and psychologists, and because like to be a modern thinker, and especially a modern philosopher, to me, it's like, well, that actually carries a lot of things. That means you're by default evolutionary biologist, default historian, default, right? Like, Nietzsche set the bar there, right? But yeah, that's the main difference, is that the philosopher is actually trying to awaken his time to life. He's trying to remain present on this earth. He's not creating more fictions. We've had enough fictions. We're actually trying to understand, well, what will or won't work for us? Because despite the misconception that in the modern day, everything goes and we can be as liberal as we like, it's like, no, actually, the path is just as narrow as it's ever been, even with Nietzsche and philosophy. By the time Nietzsche is writing its philosophy, it's only because so much else fell away. His old heroes, he had the mistake of having heroes, and that he became disillusioned too. This reminds me earlier when you were talking about being disillusioned, I thought of Nietzsche even then, right? Like in his story where he started seeing holes in his heroes and his culture and in his own thinking and how it manifested. And then you see that departure throughout the course of his works, going from this strong nihilistic, pessimistic tendency to recognizing that those growing pains, to going, you know what, I'm striking anew, and yeah, I'll take the pain and come whatever may, right? And it's like, that's it, right? And so the modern philosopher, right, he is a philosopher of the gay science or the joyful wisdom. And if he's not a modern philosopher. At least he's not a Nietzschean. And then it means he's, falls into some other category, which to me, it's like, well, now we're back in the Stone Ages or the Middle Ages rather than the Space Age or whatever. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. People have all sorts of pretentious and jargon names for everything from eternal recurrence to all the other ideas that were already established, where they just put a new shine on it and resell it.
Maybe this is why, or what you're saying is why I have started and abandoned so many novels over the years. When the artist in me tries to come out, the philosopher in me squishes him.
Yeah, no. And then no, you realize the best artists create the best fictions because they tell you the best lies. They're calling to you to indulge in this fiction, and you really have to suspend your disbelief. And I'll give you, okay, last thing I'll say.
If I may add quickly, this is why I think
Sure.
George Orwell was a better nonfiction writer than he was a fiction writer. I mean, I still like Orwell's fiction, but at the same time, when I'm reading Orwell's fiction,
don't give me an allegory. Just tell it straight, man. You can
when I'm
explain
reading
it straight.
Orwell's fiction, I always, particularly 1984, I keep feeling like Orwell's trying to lecture me throughout the novel, and so it breaks the suspension of disbelief for me when I was reading that novel. Whereas if I'm just reading his essay, then there's no fiction involved there. Or if there is, he's using it, in pursuit of the essay form is more, it's more correct when you're trying to put forward an argument.
Right, relate and for just to most effectively relate information
Exactly.
and or make an argument or a case, whether it, depending, no matter what your intention or desire may be. Sure. I'll say this, like, because I saw my dad's a soldier, right? So like he lost interest in fiction a long time ago, even though like occasionally he loves him like an alien movie or something crazy like that. But I remember we saw I think it was Oliver Stone. We saw his Alexander. This is a long time ago when it was in the theater, right? Decade or two ago. And like my dad was so mad at that movie because he comes out and he's just like bullshit. And I go, what? He goes, Alexander could not, would not, there's no way in hell that Alexander, as he existed as a historical figure, was as emotionally unstable and weepy as that Alexander. And he says it may well be that he was an emotive, because the Greeks were emotive, and I think they had much less shame of themselves and their beliefs and all that. It's a whole different conversation. But my dad got mad at it because he's like, but he's right. And the truth goes like this: like, you would never respect or follow someone if they failed these checks. And for soldiers, especially in archaic man, they would not have followed a man like that. It doesn't mean they wouldn't have followed a man who was emotional or a man who cried even. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying to the degrees that they made him come off like they made Alexander look like, I don't know, a modern American, like a decadent rock star, which I suppose maybe, he was a product of decadence. He created a kingdom of decadence because he wasn't even concerned with its preservation, right? It was just the moment he would conquer a land, it would just start to decline, right? And I guess we kind of have this pattern and problem in the West where we enjoy like it goes, we like a good show and a spot of greatness, but like kind of consequences be damned. And I guess like it seems we can only do that for so long before it catches up to us. But I just wanted to share that anecdote because I thought it was hilarious. And he's right. I've known tons of soldiers, and it's like, dude, they're some of the most honest people you'll meet next to a modern philosopher, let's say a Nietzschean. Or at least that they have that attempt to, because they have the understanding, right? Discern or perish. It's not a game. It's not just for the fun of it, right? Like, it has everything to do with who and what we are, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going in the future.
I mean, I think the complete man, and this is really hard to achieve, and I don't think I've achieved it. I don't think most people have achieved it, but I feel like the complete man really has to, fulfill 4 roles. He has to be a scientist, a historian, an artist, and a philosopher. And I think it's really hard to do all those 4 things. Most people.
And then I would say, and in the modern day, I'd probably add pillar 5 and say I would say psychologist.
Psychologist, yes.
And maybe that fits in the scientist. Maybe I'm getting too pedantic. Yeah, you might be right. Scientists might just be good for it.
But I mean, I think most people generally, they're an artist or they're a philosopher. Like they pick one role.
Right, specialization.
Specialization has led people to pick one role and then kind of forego all the other roles.
Right. So how do you stay present? So let me ask you, what's the point of being present in a world where you see everyone wants to check out, or they're always looking for the next thing to check out on? Like, what's the point of if you can't expect an artist to stay awake with you, even a philosopher to the degrees that they're an artist, maybe even they can't hang. So then my question is like, right, like to what ends and what purpose? I told you already that I think we have a purpose. I guess I'm just asking rhetorical questions, both for you and whoever may be listening, because I just think, there's plenty of food for thought in these domains as we've been going on for a while now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess my answer really, and I'm not really satisfied with the answer, but my answer has to be an individualist one, really. My answer has to be the purpose of that is.
It's perfect.
That is my nature. My nature is to
it's
synthesize information and to study matters from various, using the knowledge
it's your
various
will.
Fields.
It's clearly in your will because here you are. Right. We've been going on a while and you haven't batted an eyelash. We've been running through all sorts of stuff. Right. Regardless of going like, because trust me, plenty of the thoughts and ideas, it's like, yeah, they're not necessarily pleasant or desirable, but that's the notion of you can trust a philosopher who, because again, it's always convenient. Oh, look, go figure. My philosophy, especially my all true philosophy, right? It just happens to reflect what I think is right or morally just. So, I think it's important to be able to do those things. And to the degree that it's your nature, right? Nietzsche's got this aphorism, going against the grain. And to Nietzsche, going against the grain isn't like you're going against the grain of society. It's when you go with society against the grain of yourself, at least within that aphorism. Right. So it's like you're doing it because it's your nature, just like no different than, you know, I use another Nietzsche metaphor, a leaping tiger, right? It's a tiger's nature to leap.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I think I could see why someone wouldn't want to be a philosopher. I could see why someone
Right.
would not want to
No,
spend their
it's not the
life
same.
grappling with these difficult questions. Um,
It's not,
but
no, and it's not the same. And I guess, look, to someone who's still listening by now on this podcast, they understand. I'm saying it like there's going to be someone still listening at this point who wouldn't understand. You know, it's right. So it's a funny thing, but I guess in the odd case that is true, you know, I will say it's like this, you know, because I think it might, if we're coming from the outside, that might seem not obvious, but more like that. I guess the assumption is, again, when people say what liberalism has failed, my thoughts are no, it's been wildly successful. People delusionally believe in equality, or they misunderstand the whole notion of, let's say, something like equality. Like,
mhm.
again, the only use of equality that I see is being like, well, you give people a chance and you let them fulfill their potential because that's important to civilization and people and each other and a family. Like, right, it's important that a mom does her jobs. It's important that a dad does her jobs, right? It's important that a child does his jobs. um you know, because things fall apart when they don't, right? A family falls apart quickly if one of the parents is absent or sick, you know. um it's like, despite modern existence being easier, it's like, it actually, I think the confessions come out that existence is as hard as it's ever been for people. It's just, it seems like the arenas of suffering hasn't changed. It seems like it's become more emotion, what we would conceive emotional slash mental, less physical, yet that still takes place in the body. It's still physical as far as I can tell. How is it not physical? If you're depressed from a depressed life, you know what I mean?
Or a depressed century even.
Yes. Oh, that's a perfect way. Yeah. No, I'll agree. It's been a very depressed and depressive century. You know, we're barely out of the Middle Ages, and I don't know that people understand that. Like, we still actually operate again in a lot of that physiology of the Middle Ages, meaning we are still superstitious apes who feel the same way as we always did. We're still as prejudicial as we ever were. We're still as reactive as we ever were, in a lot of ways, right? And I mean our animal biology, because we have not escaped certain needs. Like, until we start taking in energy straight from the sun, like, we got to grow food, we got to hunt food. And, you know, plenty of us enjoy eating, right? Plenty of us enjoy food. And like, I think to have, oh, there you go, maybe that fits into artistry, right? To have an appreciation for not just what we would call like a spiritual feeling, but also a sensual feeling, right? Talk about a ideal, or would you call him the perfect man? Like, I'd say a perfect man, you know, he appreciates not just aesthetics, but sensuality in general, right? Because he's not afraid of it. He's not
Absolutely.
afraid of his, like, and
He's not
look, I
afraid
get,
of his own nature. Yeah.
yeah, and he's willing to take it on, and he's willing to embrace it, even if it's foolish, and even if it means a will to, as Nietzsche calls it, a will to stupidity from time to time, meaning like, you have your mind set on a course, and if you don't follow it, you'll never know. And to other people, they're warning you, saying don't go too far, and then there's a question of, well, how much of their warning is their own fear, or yet they're also saying, don't leave us behind, right? Don't leave me. That's what a lot of, I think, people's
Don't
fears.
surpass us.
Yeah, that too. Don't cast, you know, and look, and as a and as a fine young man and a gentleman and a scholar yourself, it's like, yeah, no, that's what I love to see. It's like, I see you well on your way, and I just say keep going, and eventually you'll make all us old farts look like shit, you know. And good, like, that's what we actually need, because it's a revitalizing process. It's always been this way, as far as I can tell. This way, and is like what back to Emerson and self-reliance. You know, this is like, it's not so much, you know, because he doesn't, I think his conception of self-reliance is more mature. You know, it's not necessarily like, oh, I'm a rugged individualist in this kind of cowboy mentality and romanticism. It's just more like an understanding that an individual winds up being the force. Like, all this comes and goes because of birth and death. Like, these are the root causes of it. It's that deep. It's the very nature of arising and passing away. And he sees the birth of a child as that which makes us elders, or us olders, at the least, obsolete or unnecessary, or as he words it, very unnecessary, because it has to be this way, because we have to update our models, because otherwise we just stagnate and die and rot. You know, we have to eventually I guess I'll put it like this. He called it whim. He says, well, I'll call it whim. He's like, I want it to be more than whim, but he's like, I can't spend the day in explanation, so I'll just call it whim. In this case, we'll call it will. We'll call it the philosopher's will. We'll call it your will. We'll call it the difference between a weak and strong will. And I see that you have a strong taste and a propensity to move in that direction. So yes, don't be afraid to see who and what is really there. And that goes for all younger and old alike, because I think it's easy to go blind. It's easy to fall into an established pattern and wind up in a rut.
Oh, definitely. And I think,
and I'm sure you see, let me ask you this real quick. Like how much of the younger generation that you've observed, both recently and even coming up, like how much cynicism and depression and things like that did you see in them? The people around you in your school and otherwise talking online, like how much of that did you observe or see?
Oh, I mean, an extreme amount is the long and short of it. I mean, and also it's gotten to the point where so there's, I think a lot of people my age and even a little younger struggle with mental illness, and they're also extremely open about it. They're also just, I mean, that you meet someone, it's like, hi, I'm Bob. Here's my childhood trauma. How are you doing today?
Yeah, it's like, whoa, man, I didn't necessarily need to know that one. But
yeah, exactly.
No, there's a time and a place, right? And it can be like, I think it'd be really good examples for talking about health and also psychoanalysis and adaptation, right? But go on. Yeah, my bad.
No, you're fine. I mean, I think there's I guess I sort of see the people who don't know that time and place to have those conversations. I guess it's because a lot of people are in so much pain and there aren't too many places to have those kinds of conversations, that now it's just coming out in the young people. Now it's just coming out casually in casual conversation. You just blurt out, the worst things about yourself or the worst experiences you've ever had.
What that actually makes me think of? That makes me actually think, one, that they don't actually have confidants, right? Because like to me, it's like that sounds unfortunate, right? That they don't actually have someone, because like again, like if you're talking about vulnerability, well, you want to be vulnerable to modern people. It's like, well, we're often quite vindictive and petty and vengeful. So like you put that out there, you're opening yourself up to an attack. You know what I mean? And it's like it's there regardless. But and I guess there's a question of like, there's a difference of doing something out of bravery and then doing it out of compulsion or because everyone else does it. Like it's the opposite of bravery, right? So I think a lot of it is they want to be, and because I've been observing this, is like, what made Soprano so revolutionary when Tony Soprano says, what happened to the strong and silent type? They didn't tell you that once they got him started talking, he'd never shut up. And it's like, yeah, these aren't the strong and silent types because they've actually been raised to be confessional. But let me tell you this, like to me, that thing, especially outside of trusted people, it's actually a mechanism people can use to control you, because then it's like, do you know how they do it in science, in the L. Ron Hubbard religion? Guess you better be I don't think they're gonna bother to sue us, but like how they do that whole, like, it's like what confession was to Catholicism is what confession is in Scientology, is what confession is in a political party, right? It's a struggle session. It's like, I wonder if this is kind of like a dumbed down American kind of struggle session. Because if you're talking about you're competing for the worst parts of yourself, it's like, well, why? Like, what is this race to the bottom? Like, why do we have a focus on illness? Like, why don't we focus on health? Like, why is that not like, even with this? Because like, look, I've done a bunch of podcasts, a bunch of writing, and I have hardly mentioned this pandemic at all, because it's like, dude, there's always a pandemic, there's always a war. It's nothing, right? This one is nothing compared to what it's been in the past. It's no all these other things, but it's like, I bring that up just for the sake of reference here. Shit, I now that I brought it up, I forget. I completely lost track of the relevance. But it's fine.
I mean, I guess to add a little more to what I said earlier about how, I guess the mental health or the mental illness of young people.
What about the some of the other attitudes and stuff about it too?
So the weird thing about, I think, my generation is there's profound pessimism, but at the same time, I don't think people my age are lazy. I don't think people my age don't like do what they have to do, but they just do it kind of to do it. right? They're just doing it like, well,
Going through
if
the
I'm
motions.
I think that a lot of them are going through the motions. And also it's sort of just like I guess the attitude of the absurdists of like, well, I'm gonna do this in spite of nothingness. I'm gonna do this in spite of failure. I'm gonna
Oh,
do this in
well, I
spite
think
of decadence. So it's like
right.
I still see people my age that are very hardworking. I
Sure.
probably think the majority of them are, but
Oh no, no, of course.
they don't expect anything to come out of it. They
Right.
expect failure, destitution,
Right. Well,
catastrophe.
well, maybe that's more, but here's the thing. So I guess from a realistic point of view, it's not bad. Yet it's also, I'd say, you don't want to like it's hard to parse when you're actually poisoning yourself to your own actions and will. You know what I mean? It's like easy to say like, I'm engaging in this to these ends and I don't actually know what will come of it versus shooting yourself in the foot and saying screw it or it's not that important. Like there's always a question of, depending on your conscious or unconscious attitude, what your actual intentions are for yourself. If you actually wanted to follow through or you meant something or you're just doing it because someone else told you to, you know what I mean? It's really, it's a weird field to parse without knowing more information, let's say on an individual. But in terms of the tendency, I mean, I think part of it does come from our, right, it does come from our institutions and our culture itself, because we do have a big concern with morality and helping one, like that's always been a part of Western culture, that, what do you call it, that Messiah complex.
Mhm.
Yeah, like that's been inherent here for a long time. And it's godlike physiology, right? It's like going like, yeah, I'm so smart and I'm better than everyone else, listen to me. Like, I think that's kind of what makes a philosopher feel good, regardless of what he's saying is accurate or true. It's more like, well, he feels pretty good and you can see it in his words. you know Back to Rousseau, like if he's a common man who's speaking as if he's a great aristocrat or a great king who's been wronged, he's letting you know how he feels about it, and he feels indignant. And like, to me, there's nothing wrong, like you won't find a bigger proponent of the youth than me, but to me, it's a question of, again, power with values. So it's like, if I look around and see like, well, I question with the youth, it's like, how many of them have spent more times in government institutions and online than they have actually socializing with other people? And like, how long, I could ask a long series of questions going, what's actually good for them or not. And this has nothing to do with the judgment of, because like the aesthetics don't matter. Like I love all kinds of music, things change over time, none of that stuff. Like that's all, I guess it does. I'm not going to say they're irrelevant, but they're secondary to like a question of, well, what's actually good for both the short term and long term of your civilization is. So I guess the question winds up being, are these ideas good for the children? Are the children having and perpetuating these ideas, is it good for them and their children? And like when you look at things like, like a lot of the profound pessimism that leads people to antinatalism, and it may or may not be a phase, let's say, but to me it is still a mind virus. It is a sort of what do you call it, an infection or an illness, a sickness. It's a drive of decadence, right? And the drive of decadence isn't the same as the drive of health. And I think some people can and do grow out of it because they have the will to. And I think other people get subsumed inside mental illness, or whether it kind of begins as an external depression but becomes a kind of learned helplessness where someone just doesn't know what to do with themselves or their life. They feel hapless and helpless before so many forces before them. Like you can see that sort of thing and understand why people feel that way, to my mind at least. And then there's a question of, well, what's actually good for people? And then the philosopher's job in his position is to discern actually what that is, and then to try and understand it and map it and then explain it to see if it can actually be applied. And then it kind of goes from there. And like at the end of the day, for philosophers themselves, it's individual, because every time you try and hide behind someone or something, like, we just know too much. We know what you're doing. We've seen this before. But in terms of philosophy that's to pertain to a population and a people and a culture, it's like, well, that's a different affair. And it's actually just as important as ever, whether or not anyone understands it. And I guess that's where I'll shut up for now.
Yeah, I guess my final thought then would be, and this sort of sounds I think this would sound counterintuitive, particularly given like
Sure.
the state of college campuses and political correctness running amok and whatnot. But I think the interesting contrast between today and say many times in the past is, I don't think kids are allowed to be like ignorant or innocent anymore. I don't really think like, I think
Oh,
people are growing up too, I mean, I think people are, I guess to put it in more cliche terms, people are
no,
growing
you're
up too
right.
fast, or the sort of optimism, the blind optimism that is supposed to be associated with youth. I don't think that youth have that blind optimism anymore, and I think
No.
it does have to say something about the state of our nation, the state of our world.
Oh, well, it's to me. Okay, check it
When
out.
the people with the least amount of experience, who should be the most
Yes, innocent.
blindly optimistic and innocent,
Yes.
are not blindly optimistic and innocent, and they act like and they think in ways that come from that are more
So,
associated with like seasoned adults, or like,
and let me ask you,
the
and
grumpy
how
old
much have they
men.
done that to you? How much have they done that to you? Like, did it feel like you had that external pressure? Because when you said that, my immediate thought is that's actually the ultimate. Like, to me, that's seeing the penultimate kind of nadir of whatever this decadence is onto the next one, where the war and the conflict has become so heated within our civilization that we can no longer even, not only is hypocrisy a second thought and cognitive dissonance not even a second thought, but that when children are willingly used as political pawns, it's like, your civilization has reached the ultimate decadence, because you're no longer letting them be their best selves, which is themselves, because that is the unique potential that is a new man, that is a new child, right? You don't know if he's going to be the greatest philosopher who ever lived or the greatest political leader who ever lived, but he could be, you know what I mean? We actually don't know where that person is coming from. Chances are he's coming from the top. Sometimes not, though, right? They can come from all over. And so to me, when you start robbing the children of that opportunity, that's just like shit. Like, that's the funerary dirge playing out. That's almost like the living elegy, or like maybe it's on life support at that point. I don't know what that is, but that to me is just profoundly sad.
Yeah, I mean, I have the experience, and it's hard to parse out like how much of this is just my own my own history or my own past versus like
No, but I've seen it too.
what's coming from the culture and what
We've
other
seen and
people.
observed it too, man. Like, I know I knew all too well exactly what you meant, and I can see it more clearly now than ever.
um but yeah, I do think it is. I don't think it is just about my life. I think it is something which we can extrapolate to the culture as a whole. I don't know if like I've never really traveled. Unfortunately, I haven't had the
It's all right. No,
opportunity.
you don't, dude.
I haven't had the opportunity to travel outside the United States, so I don't know if young
You don't have
people.
to go to exotic locales to. Oh, but go on.
Well, no, I was just gonna say I don't know if the young people the type of experience I'm talking about, is
Oh yeah.
only true if it's a like a peculiarly American thing, or if it's like something that many
Oh
youth
right.
around the world are also experiencing.
Right. Well, I would
I
say
can't speak to that, but
well,
I
to a
think it's definitely
degree,
true in America.
sure. And see, there's a problem, I guess, because it's a good point. But I guess to the degree that culture uh, reflects and recreates itself in all individuals, it does have a bit of a universal, but in terms of that modern decadent political aspect, that is, I'm thinking, uniquely like that's an American expression, not like a human nature expression. I'd
Mhm.
say the broader perspective of culture always kind of tries to turn us homogenous, like, right, making sausage, if you will. But let me just to say where we have not surmounted history. This will be my final thought, because it's actually Zarathustra's final thought. Let's see, because he's talking about the children. Ye are laughable unto me, ye present day men, and especially when ye marvel at yourselves. And woe unto me if I could not laugh at your marveling, and had to swallow all that is repugnant in your platters. As it is, however, I will make lighter of you, since I have to carry what is heavy. And what matters if beetles and maybugs also alight on my load? Verily, it shall not on that account become heavier of me, and not from you, ye present day men, shall my great weariness arise. But but a home have I found nowhere. Unsettled am I in all cities, and decamping at all gates. Alien to me and a mockery are the present day men, to whom of late my heart impelled me and exiled me. Am I from fatherlands and motherlands? Thus do I love only my children's land, the undiscovered in the remotest sea. For it do I bid my sails search and search. Unto my children will I make amends for being the child of my fathers, and unto all the future for this present day. Thus spake Zarathustra. right? He wanted to free the children from revenge, not perpetuate it. And I'm good. I can't add anything more than that.
Yeah, no, I think I have to give Zarathustra the last word here.
Yeah, and to me, that's when I think of any kind of better education for the future. That's it. It's like in that direction. It's a lot of these things, but in that direction.
Yeah, if education is like a tax that we have to pay, so it's like, I guess people, I mean, so I guess an argument Keegan and I had once was like, whether or not school should be mandatory. But I guess on the side of, if school is going to be mandatory, then what is the best way? What do we want the kids to get out of it if we're going to force them to be in these buildings with these teachers and study math and history and science and language and whatever. If education is like the price you have to pay, then what are we returning to you in value?
Right. No, and it's a question because if it's not sound values, it could, rather than like giving you a platform of ethos, right, a platform of action in life and helping you surpass yourself and others, because ideally, right, again, we want the civilization to survive. No parents, I think a lot of young people don't understand this, and a lot of the cynical people don't understand this because they're not parents and they have no conception, right, is that like the parents want their children to be better off than they were, and it doesn't necessarily mean more sheltered and less suffering. It just means like, better and more, and maybe that's not realistic, but at the very least you understand the impulse of, well, I want you to survive and do well for yourself and have a good life, because we to the degrees that a parent might love life, they might instill that same love into their child. Where parents don't feel love, right, you see dysfunction, you see abandonment, you see bad education, you see the preaching of and teaching of revenge, you see all these things. But hey, I should get going, man. Thanks for having me. It's been thoroughly enjoyed our chat here.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for talking to me. And would you like to tell the audience where people can find your work before you
my website?
You go?
Sure, thank you. My website, bezabezar.com. That's bezar.com, and that's about it for now.
Sounds good. Well, again, yeah, thank you for talking to me. I really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully we can do this again sometime soon.
Likewise, look forward to it.